The Art of Travel, written and read by Alain de Botton. On anticipation. It was hard to say when exactly winter arrived. The decline was gradual, like that of a person into old age, inconspicuous from day to day, until the season became an established, relentless reality. First came a dip in evening temperatures, then days of continuous rain, confused gusts of Atlantic wind, the fall of leaves. By December, the new season was entrenched, and the city covered almost every day by an ominous, steely grey sky, like one in a painting by Mantegna or Veronese, the perfect backdrop to the crucifixion of Christ, or to a day beneath the bedclothes. The neighbourhood park became a desolate spread of mud and water. Passing it one evening during a downpour, I recalled how, in the intense heat of the previous summer, I had stretched out on the ground and let my bare feet caress the grass, and how this direct contact with the earth had brought with it a sense of freedom and expansiveness, summer breaking down the usual boundaries between indoors and out, and allowing me to feel as much at home in the world as in my own bedroom. But now the park was foreign once more, the grass a forbidding arena in the incessant rain. Any sadness I might have felt, any suspicion that happiness or understanding was unattainable, seemed to find ready encouragement in the sodden buildings and low skies tinged orange by the city's streetlights. Such circumstances, together with a sequence of events that seemed to confirm Chamfort's dictum that a man must swallow a toad every morning to be sure of not meeting with anything more revolting in the day ahead, conspire to render me intensely susceptible to the unsolicited arrival of a large, brightly illustrated brochure entitled Winter Sun. Its cover displayed palm trees on a sandy beach, fringed by a turquoise sea set against a backdrop of hills, where I imagined there to be waterfalls and relief from the heat in the shade of sweet-smelling fruit trees. Those responsible for the brochure had darkly intuited how easily their readers might be turned into prey by photographs whose power insulted their intelligence. Photographs of palm trees, clear skies, and white beaches. Readers who would have been capable of skepticism and prudence in other areas of their lives reverted in contact with these elements to a primordial innocence and optimism. The longing provoked by the brochure was an example, at once touching and pathetic, of how projects and even whole lives might be influenced by the simplest and most unexamined images of happiness, of how a lengthy and ruinously expensive journey might be set into motion by nothing more than the sight of a photograph of a palm tree gently inclining in a tropical breeze. I resolved to travel to Barbados. If our lives are dominated by a search for happiness, then perhaps few activities reveal as much about the dynamics of this quest, in all its ardour and paradoxes, than our travels. They express, however inarticulately, an understanding of what life might be about, outside the constraints of work and the struggle for survival. Yet rarely are these travels considered to present philosophical problems, that is, issues requiring thought beyond the practical. We're inundated with advice on where to travel to. We hear little of why and how we should go. Though the art of travel seems naturally to sustain a number of questions, neither so simple nor so trivial, and whose study might contribute to an understanding of what the Greek philosophers beautifully termed eudaimonia, or human flourishing. One question revolves around the relationship between the anticipation of travel and its reality. I came upon a copy of J.K. Huysmans' novel À Rebours, published in 1884, whose effete and misanthropic hero, the aristocratic Duc des Esseintes, anticipated a journey to London, and offered in a process an extravagantly pessimistic analysis of the difference between what we imagine of a place and what can occur when we reach it. Huysmans recounts that the Duc des Esseintes lived alone in a vast villa on the outskirts of Paris. He rarely went anywhere, to avoid what he took to be the ugliness and stupidity of others. One afternoon in his youth, he had ventured into a nearby village for a few hours, and had felt his detestation of people grow fierce. Since then, he had chosen to spend his days alone, reading the classics of literature and moulding acerbic thoughts about humanity. However, early one morning, the Duke surprised himself by an intense wish to travel to London. The desire came upon him as he sat by the fire, reading a volume of Dickens. The book evoked visions of English life, which he grew increasingly keen to see. Unable to withhold his excitement, he ordered his servants to pack his bags. Because he had some time to spare before the departure of the London train, he went to Gallignani's English bookshop on the Rue de Rivoli and bought a volume of Baedeker's Guide to London. He was thrown into delicious reveries by its terse descriptions of London's attractions. He moved on to a wine bar nearby, frequented by a largely English clientele. The atmosphere was out of Dickens. He thought of scenes where little Dorrit, Dora Copperfield, and Tom Pinch's sister Ruth sat in similarly cosy, bright rooms. Hungry, Des Esseintes went next to an English tavern in the Rue d'Amsterdam. It was dark and smoky there, with a line of beer pools along a counter, which was spread with hams as brown as violins. Seated at small wooden tables were robust English women with cheeks as red as apples. Des Esseintes ordered oxtail soup, a smoked haddock, roast beef and potatoes, a couple of pints of ale, and a chunk of Stilton. However, as the moment to board his train approached, along with the chance to turn dreams of London into reality, Des Esseintes was abruptly overcome with lassitude. He thought how wearying it would be actually to go to London, how he'd have to fight for a porter, endure an unfamiliar bed, stand in queues, feel cold, and move his fragile frame around the sights that Baedeker had so tersely described, and thus soil his dreams. What was the good of moving when a person could travel so wonderfully sitting in a chair? Wasn't he already in London, whose smells, citizens, and food were all about him? What could he expect to find over there, except fresh disappointments? Still seated at his table, Des Esseintes reflected, I must have been suffering from some kind of mental aberration to have rejected the visions of my obedient imagination, and to have believed, like any old ninny, that it was necessary, interesting, and useful to travel abroad. And so Des Esseintes took the train back to his villa and never left home again. We are familiar with the notion that the reality of travel is not quite what we anticipated. The pessimistic school, of which Des Esseintes might be an honorary patron, therefore argues that reality must always be disappointing. But it may be truer and more rewarding to suggest that reality is primarily different. After 2 months of anticipation, on a cloudless February afternoon, I touched down, along with my travelling companion M, at Barbados's Grantley Adams Airport. There'd been a revolution in the climate. In a few hours, I had travelled to a heat and humidity that at home would never have achieved such intensity. Nothing in Barbados was quite as I'd imagined it, surprising only if one considers what I had imagined. In the preceding weeks, the thought of the island had circled exclusively around 3 mental images. The first was of a beach with a palm tree against the setting sun. The second was of a hotel bungalow with a view through French doors into a room decorated with wooden floors and white bed linen. And the third was of an azure sky. If pressed, I would naturally have recognized that the island had to include other elements, but I hadn't needed these in order to build an impression of it. However, on arrival, a range of things insisted that they too deserved to be included within the folds of the word Barbados. For example, a large petrol storage facility and a small plywood box where an immigration official sat and gazed with unhurried wonder at the passports of a line of tourists that stretched out of the terminal and onto the airfield. There was an advertisement for rum above the baggage carousel, a picture of the Prime Minister in the customs corridor, and a confusion of taxi drivers and tour guides outside the terminal building. And if there was a problem with this profusion of images, it was that they made it strangely harder to see the Barbados I had come to find. In anticipation, there'd simply been a vacuum between the airport and my hotel. Nothing had existed in my mind between the beautifully rhythmic arrival BA 2155 at 15:35 and the hotel room. I'd had no thought of and now protested inwardly at the appearance of a luggage carousel with a frayed rubber mat, 2 flies dancing above an overflowing ashtray, a white taxi with a fake leopard skin-lined dashboard, a stray dog in a stretch of waste ground, an advertisement for luxury condos at a roundabout, a factory called Bardak Electronics, a row of buildings with red and green tin roofs, a brightly coloured bush whose name I didn't know, a hotel reception area which showed the time in 6 different locations, and a card pinned on the wall that read, "Merry Christmas." Only several hours after my arrival did I find myself united with my imagined room, though I'd had no prior mental image of its vast air-conditioning unit. If we're inclined to forget how much there is in the world besides that which we anticipate, then works of art are perhaps a little to blame, for in them we find the same process of simplification or selection at work as in the imagination. Artistic accounts involve severe abbreviations of what reality will force upon us. Travel book may tell us, for example, that a narrator journeyed through the afternoon to reach the hill town of X and, after a night in its medieval monastery, awoke to a misty dawn. But in fact we never simply journey through an afternoon. We sit in a train, lunch digests awkwardly within us, the seat cloth is grey, we look out of the window at a field, we look back inside, a drum of anxieties revolves in consciousness. We notice a luggage label affixed to a suitcase in a rack above the opposing seats. A broken nail on an index finger catches a thread. It starts to rain. We wonder where the ticket might be. We look back out at the field. It continues to rain. At last the train starts to move. It passes an iron bridge, after which it stops inexplicably. A fly lands on the window. And still, after all this, we might only have reached the end of the first minute of a comprehensive account of the events lurking within the deceptive sentence, "He journeyed through the afternoon." A storyteller who provided us with such a profusion of details would rapidly grow maddening. Unfortunately, life itself often subscribes to this mode of storytelling, wearying us with repetitions, misleading emphases, and inconsequential plot lines. It insists on showing us Bardak Electronics, a stray dog, a Christmas card, and a fly in a laden ashtray. All of which explains the curious phenomenon whereby valuable elements may be easier to experience in art and in anticipation than in reality. The anticipatory and artistic imaginations omit and compress. They cut away the periods of boredom and direct our attention to certain critical moments, and so, without either lying or embellishing, they lend to life a vividness and a coherence that it may lack in the distracting woolliness of the present. As I lay awake in bed on my first Caribbean night, looking back on my journey, already the confusion of the present moment began to recede, and certain events to assume prominence, for memory was in this respect similar to anticipation, an instrument of simplification and selection. Of my 9.5-hour flight to the island, active memory retained only 6 or 7 static images. My layers of experience settled into a compact and well-defined narrative. I became a man who'd flown in from London and checked into his hotel. I fell asleep early, and the next morning awoke to my first Caribbean dawn, though there was, inevitably, a lot more beneath these brisk words than that. There was one other country that, many years before his intended trip to England, the Duc des Esseintes had wanted to see: Holland. The Duke had imagined that the place would resemble the paintings of Teniers and Jan Steen, Rembrandt and Ostade. He'd anticipated patriarchal simplicity and riotous joviality, some quiet, small brick courtyards, and pale-faced maids pouring milk. And so the Duke had journeyed to Haarlem and Amsterdam, and been greatly disappointed. It was not that the paintings had lied. There had been some simplicity and joviality, some nice brick courtyards and a few serving women pouring milk. But these gems were blended in a stew of ordinary images, restaurants, offices, uniform houses and featureless fields, which these Dutch artists had never painted, and which made the experience of actually travelling in the country strangely diluted compared with an afternoon in the Dutch galleries of the Louvre, where the essence of Dutch beauty found itself collected in just 1 or 2 rooms. Désessart ended up in the paradoxical position of feeling more in Holland, that is, more intensely in contact with the elements he loved in Dutch culture, when looking at selected images of Holland in a museum than when travelling with 16 pieces of luggage and 2 servants through the country itself. Awakening early on that first morning in Barbados, I went out onto the veranda. In the first light, the sky was a pale grey blue, and it was as quiet as a library. Beyond the hotel room stretched a wide beach, which was covered at first with coconut trees, and then sloped unhindered towards the sea within a small horseshoe bay. The trees provided shade, the sand was the colour of sun-ripened wheat, and the air, even in the shade, had an enveloping, profound warmth to it, so unlike the fragility of northern European heat, always prone to cede to a more assertive, proprietary chill. I walked across the sand to the edge of the sea. Behind me, the raffia roofs of the hotel bungalows were visible between gaps in the trees. Ahead of me was a view that I recognized from the brochure. The beach stretched away in a gentle curve towards the tip of the bay. Behind it were jungle-covered hills, and the first row of coconut trees inclined towards the turquoise sea, as though craning their necks to catch a better angle of the sun. Yet this description imperfectly reflects what occurred within me that morning, for my attention was, in truth, far more fractured and confused than it suggests. My awareness was weakened by incongruous and unrelated elements. Among these, a sore throat, a worry at not having informed a colleague that I'd be away, and a rising need to visit the bathroom. A momentous, but until then, rather overlooked fact was making its first appearance. That I had, inadvertently, brought myself with me to the island. It is easy to forget ourselves when we contemplate pictorial and verbal descriptions of faraway places. At home, as my eyes had panned over photographs of Barbados, concentrating on a hotel room, a beach or a sky, there were no reminders that they were intimately tied to a body and mind which might threaten or even negate the purpose of what the eyes had come to see. My body and mind were to prove temperamental partners in the goal of appreciating my destination. The body found it hard to sleep. It complained of heat, flies, and difficulties digesting hotel meals. The mind revealed a commitment to anxiety, boredom, free-floating sadness, and financial alarm. Unlike the continuous, enduring contentment that we anticipate, it seems that happiness with and in a place must prove a brief and, to the conscious mind, apparently haphazard phenomenon, an interval in which we achieve receptivity to the world around us, in which positive thoughts of past and future coagulate, and anxieties are allayed. But this fortunate condition rarely endures for much longer than 10 minutes. New patterns of anxiety seem inevitably to form on the horizon of consciousness. The past victory no longer looks so impressive. The future acquires complications, and the beautiful view becomes as invisible as anything which is always around. I was to discover an unexpected continuity between the melancholic self I'd been at home and the person I was to be on the island, a continuity quite at odds with a radical discontinuity in the landscape and climate, where the very air seemed to be made of a different and sweeter substance. Mid-morning on the first day, Em and I sat on deck chairs outside our beach hut. A single cloud hung shyly above the bay. Em put on her headphones and began annotating Emile Durkheim's On Suicide. I looked around me. It would have seemed to observers that I was where I lay, but I, that is, the conscious part of myself, had in truth abandoned the physical envelope in which it dwelt, in order to start worrying about the future, specifically about the issue of whether lunches would be included in the price of the hotel room. 2 hours later, seated at a corner table of the hotel restaurant, eating a papaya, lunch and local taxes included, the I that had left the body on the deck chair now made another migration, left the island altogether, to visit a troubling project scheduled for the following year. It was as if a vital evolutionary advantage had been bestowed centuries ago on those members of the species who lived in a state of concern about just what was to happen next. These ancestors might have failed to savor their experiences appropriately, but they had at least survived and shaped the character of their descendants, while their more focused siblings, at one with the moment and the place they stood in, had met violent ends on the horns of unforeseen bison. If fidelity to a place had seemed possible from home, it was perhaps because I'd never tried to stare at a picture of Barbados for any length of time. Had I laid one on a table and forced myself to look at it exclusively for 25 minutes, my mind and body would naturally have migrated towards a range of other concerns, and I might thereby have gained a more accurate sense of how little the place in which I stood had the power to influence what travelled through my mind. In another paradox that Des Esseintes would have appreciated, it seems we may best be able to inhabit a place when we're not faced with the additional challenge of actually having to be there. A few days before our departure, Em and I decided to explore the island. We rented a mini moke and headed north to an area of rugged hills called Scotland, to where Oliver Cromwell had exiled English Catholics in the 17th century. At Barbados's northernmost tip, we visited Animal Flower Cave, a series of caverns hollowed out of the rock face by the waves, in which giant sea anemones grew along the pitted walls and looked like yellow and green flowers. At midday, we headed south towards the parish of St. John, and there, on a tree-covered hill, found a restaurant in an old colonial mansion, where tables were set out along a gallery, with a view of the gardens and the sea. Em ordered jumbo shrimp. I had a kingfish. We talked about the colonial system and the curious ineffectiveness of even the most powerful sunblocks. For dessert, we ordered 2 creme caramel. When these arrived, Em received a large but messy portion, which looked as though it had fallen over in the kitchen, and I a tiny but perfectly formed one. As soon as the waiter had stepped out of eyeshot, Em reached over and swapped my plate for hers. "Don't steal my dessert," I said, incensed. "I thought you wanted the bigger one," she replied, no less affronted. "You're just trying to get the better one," I complained. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm trying to be nice to you. Stop being so suspicious." "I will," I said, "if you give me back my portion." In only a few moments, we found ourselves in a shameful period, where, beneath infantile rounds of bickering, there stirred mutual terrors of incompatibility and infidelity. Em handed back my plate grimly, took a few spoons from hers, and pushed the dessert to one side. We said nothing. We drove back to the hotel, the sound of the engine disguising the intensity of our sulks. The room had been cleaned. The bed had fresh linen. There were flowers on the chests of drawers and new beach towels in the bathroom. I tore one from the pile and went to sit on the veranda, closing the French doors violently. The coconut trees were throwing a gentle shade, the criss-cross patterns of their palms occasionally rearranging themselves in the afternoon breeze. But there was no pleasure in such beauty. I'd enjoyed nothing aesthetic or material since the struggle over the creme caramel a few hours before. It had become irrelevant that there were soft towels, flowers, and attractive views. My mood refused to be lifted by any external prop. It even felt insulted by the perfection of the weather and a beachside barbecue scheduled for the evening. Our misery that afternoon, in which the smell of tears mixed with that of sun cream and air conditioning, was a reminder of the rigid, unforgiving logic to which human moods seem subject, and which we ignore at our peril when we encounter a picture of a beautiful land and imagine that happiness must naturally accompany such magnificence. Our capacity to draw happiness from aesthetic or material goods seems critically dependent on first satisfying a more important range of emotional or psychological needs, among them the need for understanding, for love, expression, and respect. We're not able to enjoy sumptuous tropical gardens and attractive wooden beach huts when a relationship to which we're committed abruptly reveals itself to be suffused with incomprehension and resentment. If we're surprised by the power of just one sulk to destroy the beneficial effects of an entire hotel, it's because we misunderstand what holds up our moods. We're sad at home, and we blame the weather and the ugliness of the buildings. But on a tropical island we learn, after an argument in a raffia bungalow under an azure sky, that the state of the skies and the appearance of our dwellings can never on their own underwrite our joy, nor condemn us to misery. There is a contrast between the vast projects we set in motion, the construction of hotels and the dredging of bays, and the basic psychological knots that undermine them. How quickly the advantages of civilization are wiped out by a tantrum. The intractability of these mental knots points to the austere, wry wisdom of certain ancient philosophers who walked away from prosperity and sophistication and argued, from within a barrel or a mud hut, that the key ingredients of happiness could never be material or aesthetic, but were always stubbornly psychological, a lesson that never seemed truer than when Em and I made up at nightfall in the shadow of a beachside barbecue whose luxury had become a humbling irrelevance. After his abortive visit to England, the Duc des Esseintes did not attempt another journey abroad. He remained in his villa and surrounded himself with objects which facilitated the finest aspect of travel, its anticipation. He had coloured prints hung on the walls, like those in travel agents' windows, showing foreign cities, museums, hotels, and steamers bound for Valparaiso or the River Plate. He had the itineraries of the major shipping companies framed and lined his bedroom with them. He filled an aquarium with seaweed and bought a sail, some rigging, and a pot of tar, and with their help was able to experience the most pleasant sides of a long sea voyage without any of its inconveniences. Des Esseintes concluded, in Huysmans' words, that the imagination could provide a more than adequate substitute for the vulgar reality of actual experience. Actual experience where what we have come to see is always diluted in what we could see anywhere, where we're drawn away from the present by an anxious future, and where our appreciation of aesthetic elements remains at the mercy of perplexing physical and psychological demands. I travelled in spite of Des Esseintes, and yet there were times when I too felt there might be no finer journeys than those provoked in the imagination by remaining quietly at home, slowly turning the pages of the British Airways worldwide timetable. On travelling places. Overlooking the motorway between London and Manchester, in a flat, featureless expanse of country, stands a single-storey, glass and red brick service station. In its forecourt hangs a giant flag that advertises to motorists and perhaps the sheep in an adjacent field a photograph of a fried egg, 2 sausages, and a peninsula of baked beans. I arrived at the service station with the sky turning red in the west. I'd been on the road for a couple of hours, alone with clouds forming on the horizon, with the lights of commuter towns beyond the grass banks, with motorway bridges and the silhouettes of overtaking cars and coaches. I felt dizzy stepping out of my craft. My senses needed to readjust themselves to firm land, to the wind, and to the discreet sounds of night drawing in. The restaurant was brightly illuminated and exaggeratedly warm. Large photographs of coffee cups, pastries, and hamburgers hung on the walls. I slid a damp tray along a metal runway, bought a bar of chocolate and an orange juice, and sat by a window that made up one whole wall of the building. Vast panes were held in place by strips of beige putty, into whose chewy clamminess I was tempted to dig my nails. Beyond the window, the grass sloped down to the motorway, where traffic ran in silent, elegant symmetry along 6 lanes. The differences in cars disguised by the gathering darkness, leaving a uniform ribbon of red and white diamonds extending into infinity in 2 directions. There were few other customers in the service station. A woman was idly rotating a tea bag in a cup. A man and 2 small girls were eating hamburgers. A bearded elderly man was doing a crossword. No one was talking. There was an air of reflection, of sadness too, only heightened by the faint sound of piped, upbeat music and the enamel smile of a woman about to bite into a bacon sandwich in a photograph above the counter. In the middle of the room, hanging from the ceiling, was a cardboard box announcing an offer of free onion rings with every hot dog. The building was architecturally miserable. It smelt of frying oil and lemon-scented floor polish. The food was glutinous and the tables dotted with islands of dried ketchup from the meals of long-departed travellers. And yet something about this place moved me. There was poetry in this forsaken service station, perched on the ridge of the motorway, far from all habitation. Its appeal made me think of certain other, equally and unexpectedly poetic travelling places, airport terminals, harbours and train stations, and the work of a 19th century writer who'd been unusually alive to the power of the liminal travelling place. Charles Baudelaire was born in Paris in 1821. From an early age, he felt uncomfortable at home. His father died when he was 5, and his mother married a man he disliked. He was sent to a succession of boarding schools and repeatedly expelled for insubordination. In adulthood, he could find no place in bourgeois society. He quarrelled with his mother and stepfather, and in his diary complained of suffering from that appalling disease, the horror of home, and from a feeling of loneliness from earliest childhood, despite my family, and with school friends especially, a feeling of being destined to an eternally solitary life. Baudelaire dreamt of leaving France for somewhere else, somewhere far away, on another continent, somewhere with no reminders of the everyday, a term of horror for the poet, somewhere with warmer weather, a place, in the words of the legendary couplet from L'Invitation au Voyage, where everything would be ordre et beauté, luxe, calme et volupté. But Baudelaire was aware of the difficulties. He'd once left the leaden skies of northern France and returned dejected. He'd set off on a journey to India. 3 months into the sea crossing, the ship had run into a storm and had stopped in Mauritius for repairs. This was the lush, palm-fringed island that Baudelaire had long dreamt of. But he couldn't shake off a feeling of lethargy and sadness, and suspected that India would be no better. Despite efforts by the captain to persuade him otherwise, he insisted on sailing straight back to France. The result for Baudelaire was a lifelong ambivalence towards travel. In his poem Le Voyage, he has sarcastically imagined the accounts of travellers returned from afar. We saw stars and waves, we saw sand too, and, despite many crises and unforeseen disasters, we were often bored, just like here. And yet, Baudelaire remained sympathetic to the wish to travel, and observed its tenacious hold on himself. No sooner had he returned from his Mauritian trip than he began to dream once again of going somewhere else. He wrote, "Life is a hospital, where every patient is obsessed by changing beds. This one wants to suffer in front of the radiator, and that one thinks he'd get better by the window." Nevertheless, Baudelaire was unashamed to count himself among the patients. "It always seems to me," he wrote, "that I'll be well where I am not, and this question of moving somewhere else is one that I'm forever entertaining with my soul." Sometimes Baudelaire dreamt of going to Lisbon. It would be warm there, and he would, like a lizard, gain strength from stretching himself out in the sun. It was a city of water, marble and light, conducive to thought and calm. But no sooner had this Portuguese fantasy arisen than Baudelaire would think that he might perhaps be happier in Holland. Then again, why not Java, or else the Baltic, or even the North Pole, where he could bathe in shadows and watch comets fly across the Arctic skies? But the destination wasn't really the point. Baudelaire's true desire was to get away, as he concluded, anywhere, so long as it's out of this world. Baudelaire honoured reveries of travel as a mark of noble, questing souls, who he described as poets, people who couldn't be satisfied with the horizons of home, even while they appreciated the limits of other lands, people whose temperaments oscillated between hope and despair, childlike idealism and cynicism. It was the fate of poets, like Christian pilgrims, to live in a fallen world, while refusing to surrender a vision of an alternative, less compromised realm. Against such ideas, one detail stands out in Baudelaire's biography, that he was, throughout his life, strongly drawn towards harbours, docks, railway stations, trains, ships, and hotel rooms, that he felt more at home in the transient places of travel than in his own dwelling. When Baudelaire was oppressed by the atmosphere in Paris, when the world seemed to him, in his words, monotonous and small, he would leave for leaving's sake, he said, and travel to a harbour or train station, where he would inwardly exclaim, in the words of one of his poems, "Carriage, take me with you, ship, steal me away from here, take me far, far away, here the mud is made of our tears." In an essay, T.S. Eliot proposed that Baudelaire had been the first 19th-century artist to give expression to the beauty of modern travelling places and machines. Baudelaire, wrote Eliot, invented a new kind of romantic nostalgia, the poésie des départs, the poésie des salles d'attente, and, one might add, the poésie des stations-service and the poésie des aéroports. When feeling sad at home, I've often gone to Heathrow, where, from an observation gallery, I've drawn comfort from the sight of the ceaseless landing and take-off of aircraft. In the difficult year of 1859, in the aftermath of the Les Fleurs du Mal trial and the break-up with his mistress, Jeanne Duval, Baudelaire visited his mother at her home in Honfleur, and, for much of his 2-month stay, occupied a chair at the quayside, watching vessels docking and departing. Those large and beautiful ships, he wrote, invisibly balanced, hovering on tranquil waters, those hardy ships that look dreamy and idle, don't they seem to whisper to us in silent tongues, "When shall we set sail for happiness?" From a car park beside 09 left, 27 right, as the north runway is known to pilots, the 747 appears at first as a small, brilliant white light, a star dropping towards Earth. It's been in the air for 12 hours. It took off from Singapore at dawn. It flew over the Bay of Bengal, Delhi, the Afghan desert, and the Caspian Sea. It traced a course over Romania, the Czech Republic, southern Germany, and began its descent above the grey-brown, turbulent waters off the Dutch coast. It followed the Thames over London, turned north near Hammersmith, pivoted over Uxbridge, and straightened course over Slough. From the ground, the white light gradually takes shape as a vast two-storied body with 4 engines suspended beneath implausibly long wings. In the light rain, clouds of water form a veil behind the plane on its matronly progress towards the airfield. Beneath it are the suburbs of Slough. It's 3 in the afternoon. In detached villas, kettles are being filled. A television is on in a living room. The everyday. And above Slough is a plane that just a few hours ago was flying over the Caspian Sea. Caspian Sea, Slough. The plane a symbol of worldliness, carrying within itself a trace of all the lands it's crossed, its eternal mobility offering an imaginative counterweight to feelings of stagnation and confinement. This morning, the plane was over the Malay Peninsula, a phrase in which there linger the smells of guava and sandalwood, and now, a few meters above the earth, the plane appears motionless, seeming to pause before its 16 wheels meet the tarmac with a blast of smoke that makes manifest its speed and weight. On a parallel runway, an A340 ascends for New York, and over the Staines Reservoir retracts its wheels, which it won't require again until the descent over the white clapboard houses of Long Beach, 3,000 miles and 8 hours of sea and cloud away. All across the airfield, visible through the heat haze of turbofans, planes are on the move, their fins a confusion of colours against the grey horizon, like sails at a regatta. Along the glass and steel back of Terminal 3 rest 4 giants, whose liveries indicate a varied provenance: Canada, Brazil, Pakistan, Korea. For a few hours, their wingtips will lie only a few meters apart, before each set begins another journey into the stratospheric winds. Nowhere is the appeal of the airport more concentrated than in the television screens, which hang in rows from terminal ceilings, announcing the departure and arrival of flights, and whose workmanlike casing and pedestrian typefaces do nothing to disguise their emotional charge or imaginative appeal. Tokyo, Amsterdam, Istanbul, Warsaw, Seattle, Rio. The screens bear all the poetic resonance of the last line of James Joyce's Ulysses, at once a record of where the novel was written, and, no less importantly, a symbol of the cosmopolitan spirit behind its composition. Trieste, Zurich, Paris. The constant calls of these screens suggest with what ease our seemingly entrenched lives might be altered, were we to walk down a corridor and onto a craft that in just a few hours would land us in a place of which we had no memories and where no one knew our names. How pleasant to hold in mind, through the crevasses of our moods, at 3 in the afternoon, when lassitude and despair threaten, that there's always a plane taking off for somewhere, Baudelaire's Anywhere, Anywhere, Trieste, Zurich, Paris. Baudelaire admired not only the places of departure and arrival, but also the machines of motion, in particular ocean-going ships. He wrote of the profound and mysterious charm that arises from looking at a ship. He admired the technological achievements behind them, how something so heavy and multifarious could be made to move with elegance and cohesion across the seas. A great ship made him think of a vast, immense, complicated, but agile creature, an animal full of spirit, suffering and heaving all the sighs and ambitions of humanity. Similar sentiments may arise when looking at one of the larger species of aeroplane, it too a vast and complicated creature, which defies its size and the chaos of the lower atmosphere to steer serenely across the firmament. Few seconds in life are more releasing, than those in which a plane ascends to the sky. Looking out of a window from a machine standing at the beginning of a runway, we face a vista of familiar proportions. A road, oil cylinders, grass and hotels with copper-tinted windows. The earth as we've always known it, where we make slow progress, even with the help of a car, where muscles and engines strain to reach the summit of hills, where half a mile ahead there are almost always trees or buildings to restrict our view. Then, suddenly, accompanied by the controlled rage of the engines, with only a tremor from glasses in the galley, we rise fluently into the atmosphere, and an immense horizon opens up across which we can wander without impediment. A journey which on Earth would have taken a whole afternoon can be accomplished with an infinitesimal movement of the eye. We can cross Berkshire, visit Maidenhead, skirt over Bracknell, and survey the M4. There's psychological pleasure in this takeoff too, for the swiftness of the plane's ascent is an exemplary symbol of transformation. The display of power can inspire us to imagine analogous, decisive shifts in our own lives, to imagine that we too might one day surge above much that had loomed over us. The new vantage point lends order and logic to the landscape. Roads curve to avoid hills, rivers trace paths to lakes, pylons lead from power stations to towns. Streets that from Earth seemed laid out without thought emerge as well-planned grids. The eye attempts to match what it can see with what it knows should be there. Those lights must be Newbury, that road the A33 as it leaves the M4. And to think that all along, hidden from our sight, our lives were this small, the world we live in but almost never see, the way we must appear to the hawk and to the gods. The engines show none of the effort required to take us to this place. They hang in the inconceivable cold, patiently and invisibly powering the craft. Their sole requests, painted on their inner flanks in red letters, that we don't walk on them and that we feed them oil only, D50 TFI-S4. A message for a forthcoming set of men in overalls, 4,000 miles away and still asleep. There's not much talk about the clouds visible up here. No one thinks it remarkable that somewhere above an ocean we flew past a vast white candy floss island, which would have made a perfect seat for an angel, or even God himself, in a painting by Piero della Francesca. In the cabin, no one stands up to announce with requisite emphasis that out of the window we're flying over a cloud, a matter that would have detained Leonardo and Poussin, Claude and Constable. Baudelaire knew how to love the clouds. In his poem, The Outsider, he wrote, "Tell me, whom do you love most, you enigmatic man? Your father, your mother, your sister, or your brother? I have neither father, nor mother, nor sister, nor brother. Your friends? You're using a word I've never understood. Your country? I don't know where that might lie. Beauty? I would love her with all my heart, if only she were a goddess and immortal. Money? I hate it as you hate God. Well then, what exactly do you love, you strange outsider? I love the clouds that pass by, over there, those lovely clouds. The clouds usher in tranquility. Below us are enemies and colleagues, the sites of our terrors and our griefs, all of them now infinitesimal, mere scratches on the earth. We may know this old lesson in perspective well enough, but rarely does it seem as true as when we're pressed against the cold, plain window, our craft a teacher of profound philosophy, and a faithful disciple of the Baudelairean commands. In the words of one of his poems, "Carriage, take me with you. Ship, steal me away from here. Take me far, far away. Here the mud is made of our tears." On the exotic. On disembarking at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, I notice a sign hanging from the terminal ceiling, that announces the way to the arrivals hall, the exit and the transfer desks. It's a bright yellow sign, 1 meter high and 2 across, a simple plastic fascia in an illuminated aluminium box. Despite its simplicity, even mundanity, the sign delights me, a delight for which the term exotic seems unusual, yet apt. The exoticism is located in the double A of Ankomst, in the neighbourliness of a U and an I in the word Uitgang, in the use of English subtitles, in the word for desk, balise, and in the choice of practical modernist fonts, Frutiger or Univers. If this sign provokes such pleasure, it's in part because it offers the first conclusive evidence of having arrived somewhere else. It's a symbol of being abroad. Such a sign would never exist in this form in my own country. There it would be less yellow, the typeface would be softer and more nostalgic. There would, out of greater indifference to the confusion of foreigners, be no subtitles, and the language would contain no double A's. A repetition in which I sensed, confusedly, the presence of another history and mindset. A plug socket, a bathroom tap, a jam jar, or an airport sign may tell us more than its designers intended. It may speak of the whole nation that made it. And the nation that had made the sign at Schiphol Airport seemed very far from my own. A bold archaeologist of national character might have traced the influence of the lettering back to the De Stijl movement of the early 20th century, the prominence of the English subtitles to the Dutch openness towards foreign influences, and the foundation of the East India Company in 1602, and the overall simplicity of the sign to the Calvinist aesthetic that became a part of national identity during the war between the United Provinces and Spain in the 16th century. That a sign could evolve so differently in two places was evidence of a simple but pleasing idea, that countries are diverse and practices variable across borders. Yet difference alone would not have been enough to elicit pleasure, or not for long. Difference had to seem like an improvement on what my own country was capable of. If I called the Schiphol sign exotic, it was because it succeeded in suggesting, vaguely but intensely, that the country which had made it, and which lay beyond the Uitgang, might in critical ways prove more congenial than my own to my temperament and concerns. The sign was a promise of happiness. The word exotic has traditionally been attached to more colourful things than Dutch signs, to snake charmers, harems, minarets, camels, souks, and mint tea poured from a great height into a tray of small glasses by a mustachioed servant. In the first half of the 19th century, the word exotic became synonymous with the Middle East. When Victor Hugo published his cycle of poems, Les Orientales, in 1829, he could declare in the preface, "We're all much more concerned with the Orient than ever before. The Orient has become a subject of general preoccupation, to which the author of this book has deferred." Hugo's poems featured the staples of European Orientalist literature: pirates, pashas, sultans, spices, moustaches, and dervishes. His work found an eager audience, as did the Arabian Nights, the Oriental novels of Walter Scott, and Byron's The Giaour. In January 1832, Eugène Delacroix set off to North Africa to capture the exoticism of the Orient in painting. Within 3 months of arriving in Tangier, he was wearing local dress and signing himself off to his brother as "your African." Even European public places were becoming more Oriental in appearance. On the 14th of September 1833, a crowd lined the banks of the Seine near Rouen and cheered as a French Navy boat, the Luxor, sailed upstream to Paris on its way from Alexandria, bearing the giant obelisk lifted from the temple complex at Thebes, destined for a traffic island on the Place de la Concorde. One of those standing in the crowd was a moody 12-year-old boy called called Gustave Flaubert, whose greatest wish was to leave Rouen, become a camel driver in Egypt, and lose his virginity in a harem to an olive-skinned woman. The 12-year-old held Rouen, and indeed the whole of France, in profound contempt. As he put it to his school friend, Ernest Chevalier, he had only disdain for this good civilization, which prided itself on having produced railways, poisons, cream tarts, royalty, and the guillotine. Flaubert's life was, in his words, sterile, banal, and laborious. He told his diary, "Often I'd like to be able to blow the heads off passers-by. I am bored, I am bored, I am bored." He returned repeatedly to the theme of just how boring it was to live in France, and especially in Rouen. "Today my boredom was really terrible," he reported at the end of one bad Sunday. "How beautiful are the provinces, and how chic are the comfortably off who live there. Their talk is all of money and road improvements. The neighbour is a wonderful institution. To be given his full social importance, he should always be written in capital letters." It was as a source of relief from the prosperous pettiness and civic-mindedness of his surroundings that Flaubert contemplated the Orient. References to the Middle East pervaded his early writings and correspondence. In Rage et Impuissance, a story written in 1836 when he was 15, he was at school and fantasized about killing the mayor of Rouen. Flaubert projected his Eastern fantasies onto his central character, a certain Monsieur Hamelin, who longed for the Orient with her burning sun, her blue skies, her golden minarets, her caravans through the sands. Oh, the Orient! Oh, for the tanned olive skin of Asiatic women. In 1839, Flaubert was by this time reading Rabelais and wanted to fart so loudly that he'd be heard all over Rouen. He wrote another story, Les Mémoires d'un Fou, whose autobiographical hero looked back on a youth spent longing for the Middle East. "I dreamt of faraway journeys," wrote Flaubert's narrator. "I saw the Orient, her vast sands, and her palaces teeming with camels wearing brass bells. I saw blue seas, a pure sky, silvery sand, and women with tanned skin and fiery eyes who could whisper to me in the language of the Houris." In 1841, Flaubert had by this point left Rouen and was studying law in Paris in obedience to his father's wishes. He wrote another story, Novembre, whose hero had no time for railways, bourgeois civilization, and lawyers, and identified with the traders of the East instead. "Oh, to be riding now on the back of a camel. In front of you a red sky and brown sands. On the burning horizon, the undulating landscape stretches out into infinity. In the evening, one puts up the tents, gives water to the dromedaries, lights fires to scare off the jackals that one can hear wailing in the depths of the desert, and in the morning fills the gourds at the oasis." In Flaubert's mind, the word happiness became interchangeable with the word Orient. In a moment of despair at his studies, at his lack of romantic success, at the expectations of his parents, at the weather and the accompanying complaints of farmers, it had been raining for 2 weeks, and several cows had drowned in flooded fields near Rouen. Flaubert told his friend Chevalier, "My life in my dreams so beautiful, so poetic, so vast, so filled with love, will probably turn out to be like everyone else's, monotonous, sensible, and stupid. I'll attend law school, be admitted to the bar, and end up as a respectable assistant district attorney in a small provincial town like Yvetot or Dieppe. Oh, poor madman who dreamt of glory, of love, laurels, journeys, and the Orient." The people who lived along the coasts of North Africa, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Palestine, and Syria might have been surprised that their lands had been grouped by a young Frenchman into a synonym for all that was good. "Long live the sun!" exclaimed Flaubert. "Long live the orange trees, palm trees, lotus flowers, and cool pavilions paved in marble with wood-panelled chambers that talk of love. Oh, will I never see necropolises where, towards evening, Where the camels have come to rest by their wells, hyenas will howl from beneath the mummies of kings. He would, for, at the age of 25, Flaubert's father died unexpectedly, leaving him a fortune which allowed him to sidestep the bourgeois career and accompanying small talk about drowned cattle he'd been destined for. He began at once to plan an Egyptian trip, and was assisted in the task by his friend Maxime Ducamp, a fellow student who shared his passion for the East. The two Oriental enthusiasts left Paris at the end of October 1849, and after a stormy sea crossing from Marseille, arrived in Alexandria in the middle of November. Flaubert reported to his mother, "When we were 2 hours out from the coast of Egypt, I went into the bow with the chief quartermaster and saw the seraglio of Abbas Pasha like a black dome on the blue of the Mediterranean. The sun was beating down on it. I had my first sight of the Orient through, or rather in, a glowing light that was like melted silver on the sea. Soon the shore became distinguishable, and the first thing we saw on land was a pair of camels led by their driver, then, on the dock, some Arabs peacefully fishing. Landing took place amid the most deafening uproar imaginable. Negroes, negresses, camels, turbans, cudgellings to right and left, and ear-splitting guttural cries. I gulped down a whole bellyful of colours, like a donkey filling himself with hay." That was Flaubert's experience. As for mine, in Amsterdam I took a room in a hotel in the Jordaan district, and after lunch in a café, Roggebrood met herring and uitjes, went for a walk in the western parts of the city. In Alexandria, the exotic had collected around camels, Arabs peacefully fishing, and guttural cries. For me, Amsterdam provided different examples. Buildings with elongated pale pink bricks put together with curiously white mortar. Long rows of narrow apartment buildings with large ground-floor windows. Bicycles parked outside every house. An absence of ostentatious buildings. Straight streets interspersed with small parks, suggesting the hand of planners with ideas of a socialist garden city. In one street of uniform apartment buildings, I stopped by a red front door and felt an intense longing to spend the rest of my life there. Above me on the second floor, I could see an apartment with 3 large windows and no curtains. The walls were painted white and decorated with a single large painting, filled with small blue and red dots. There was an oak desk against a wall, a large bookshelf and an armchair. I wanted the life that this space suggested. I wanted a bicycle. I wanted to put my key through the red front door every evening. I wanted to stand by the curtainless window at dusk, looking out at an identical apartment opposite, and snack my way through an Aventsup mit Roggebrood and Speck before retiring to read in bed in a white room with white sheets. Why be seduced by something as small as a front door in another country? Why fall in love with a place because it has trams and its people seldom have curtains in their homes? However absurd the intense reactions provoked by such small foreign elements may seem, the pattern is at least familiar from personal life. There, too, we find ourselves anchoring emotions of love to the way a person butters bread, or turning against them because of their taste in shoes. To condemn ourselves for these minute concerns is to ignore how rich in meaning details may be. My love for the apartment building was based on what I perceived to be its modesty. The building was comfortable but not grand. It suggested a society attracted to a financial mean. There was an honesty in the design. While front doorways in London were prone to ape the look of classical temples, in Amsterdam they accepted their status. They avoided pillars and plaster. They settled on neat, undecorated brick. The building was modern in the best sense. It spoke of order, cleanliness, and light. In the more fugitive, trivial association of the word exotic, the charm of a foreign place arises from the simple idea of novelty and change. In finding camels where at home there had been horses. In finding unadorned apartment buildings where at home they'd had pillars. But there may be a more profound pleasure. We may value foreign elements not only because they're new, but because they seem to accord more faithfully with our identity and commitments than anything our homeland could provide. My enthusiasms in Amsterdam were connected to my dissatisfactions with my own country, with its lack of modernity and aesthetic simplicity, with its resistance to urban life and its net-curtained mentality. What we find exotic abroad may be what we hunger for in vain at home. To understand why Flaubert found Egypt exotic, it may therefore be useful first to examine his feelings towards France. What would strike him as exotic, that is, both new and valuable, about Egypt, was in many ways the obverse of what had driven him to rage at home. And these were, baldly stated, the beliefs and behaviour of the French bourgeoisie, which had, since the fall of Napoleon, become the dominant force in society. For Flaubert, the French bourgeoisie was a repository of the most extreme snobbery, smugness, racism, and pomposity. It's strange, he complained in stifled rage, how the most banal utterances of the bourgeoisie sometimes make me marvel. There are gestures, sounds of people's voices that I just can't get over. Silly remarks that almost give me vertigo. The bourgeois is for me something quite unfathomable. Flaubert nevertheless spent 30 years trying to fathom it, most comprehensively in his Dictionary of Received Ideas, a satirical catalogue of the French bourgeoisie's more striking sheep-like prejudices. To group only a few of these into themes indicates the direction of Flaubert's complaints against his homeland, upon which his enthusiasm for Egypt would eventually be built. Here are a few examples taken from Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas. First, some examples of the bourgeoisie's suspicion of artistic endeavour. Absinthe. Extra violent poison. 1 glass and you're a dead man. Journalists drink it while writing their articles. It's killed more soldiers than the Bedouins. Architects. All idiots. They always forget to put staircases in houses. Examples of the bourgeoisie's intolerance and ignorance of other countries. English women. Express surprise that they can have pretty children. Camel. Has 2 humps and the dromedary 1, or else the camel has 1 and the dromedary 2. Nobody can ever remember which. Elephants. Noted for their memories and worship the sun. French. The greatest people in the world. Hotels. Are first-rate only in Switzerland. Italians. All musical, all treacherous. John Bull. When you don't know an Englishman's name, call him John Bull. Quran, book by Muhammad, which is all about women. Blacks. Express surprise that their saliva is white and that they can speak French. Black women. Hotter than white women. See also brunettes and blondes. Black, always followed by as ebony. Oasis, an inn in the desert. Harem women. All Oriental women are harem women. Palm tree, lends local colour. Examples of the bourgeoisie's machismo and earnestness. Fist. To govern France, an iron fist is needed. Gun. Always keep one in the countryside. Beard. Sign of strength. Too much beard causes baldness. Helps to protect ties. Writing to Louise Collet in August 1846, Flaubert wrote, "What stops me from taking myself seriously, even though I'm essentially a serious person, is that I find myself extremely ridiculous. Not the kind of small-scale ridiculousness of slapstick comedy, but rather a ridiculousness that seems intrinsic to human life and manifests itself in the simplest actions and most ordinary gestures. For example, I can never shave without starting to laugh. It seems so idiotic. All this is very difficult to explain." Examples of bourgeois sentimentality. Animals. If only animals could speak. There are some which are much more intelligent than men. Communion. one's first communion, the greatest day of one's life. Inspiration, poetic, aroused by the sight of the sea, love, women, etc. Illusions, pretend to have had a great many and complain that you've lost them all. Examples of faith in progress and pride in technology. Railways, enthuse about them, saying, I, my dear sir, who am speaking to you now, was at X this morning. I took the train to X, I transacted my business there, and by X o'clock I was back here. Examples of pretension. Bible, the oldest book in the world. Bedroom, in an old castle, Henri IV always spent a night in it. Mushrooms, should be bought only at market. Crusades, benefited Venetian trade. Diderot, always followed by d'Alembert. Melon, nice topic for dinner-time conversation. Is it a vegetable or a fruit? The English eat it for dessert, which is astonishing. Stroll, always take a stroll after dinner. It helps digestion. Snakes, all poisonous. Old people, when discussing a flood, thunderstorm, etc., the old cannot remember ever having seen a worse one. Examples of prissiness, repressed sexuality. Blondes, hotter than brunettes. See also brunettes. Brunettes, hotter than blondes. See also blondes. Sex, word to avoid. Say instead, intimacy occurred. With all this in mind, it appears no coincidence, no mere fashion, that it was specifically the Middle East that Flaubert was interested in. It was a logical fit. What he loved in Egypt could be traced back to central facets of his personality. Egypt lent support to ideas and values that were part of his identity, but for which his own society had had little sympathy. 1. The exoticism of chaos. From the day he disembarked in Alexandria, Flaubert noticed and felt at home in the chaos, both visual and auditory, of Egyptian life. Boatmen shouting, Nubian porters hawking, merchants bargaining, the sounds of chickens being killed, donkeys being whipped, camels groaning. There were, he said, guttural intonations that sound like the cries of wild beasts and laughter, and flowing white robes, and ivory teeth flashing between thick lips, and flat Negro noses, and dusty feet and necklaces and bracelets. It's like being hurled while still asleep into the midst of a Beethoven symphony, with the brasses at their most ear-splitting, the basses rumbling, and the flute sighing away. Each detail reaches out to grip you, it pinches you, and the more you concentrate on it, the less you grasp the whole. It's such a bewildering chaos of colours that your poor imagination is dazzled, as though by continuous fireworks, as you go about staring at minarets thick with white stalks, at tired slaves stretched out in the sun on house terraces, at the patterns of sycamore branches against walls, with camel bells ringing in your ears, and the great herds of black goats bleating in the streets amid the horses and the donkeys and the peddlers. Flaubert's aesthetic was rich. He liked purple, gold, and turquoise, and so welcomed the colours of Egyptian architecture. The Baroque quality of Egypt extended to the language used by Egyptians in the most ordinary situations. Flaubert recorded examples. A while ago, when I was looking at seeds in a shop, a woman to whom I'd given something said, "Blessings on you, my sweet lord. God grant that you return safe and sound to your native land." When Max asked a groom if he wasn't tired, the answer was, "The pleasure of being seen by you suffices." Why did the chaos, the richness touch Flaubert? Because of his belief that life is fundamentally chaotic, and that, aside from art, attempts to create order imply censorious and prudish denial of our condition. He expressed his feelings to Louise Collet during a trip to London in September 1851, only a few months after his return from Egypt. "We've just come back from a walk in Highgate Cemetery," he wrote. "What gross corruption of Egyptian and Etruscan architecture it all is. How neat and tidy it is. The people in there seem to have died wearing white gloves. I hate little gardens around graves, with well-raked flower beds and flowers in bloom. This antithesis has always seemed to me to have come out of a bad novel. When it comes to cemeteries, I like those that are run down, ravaged, in ruins, full of thorns or tall weeds, and where a cow escaped from the neighbouring field has come to graze quietly. Admit that this is better than some policeman in uniform. How stupid order is. 2. The exoticism of shitting donkeys. Yesterday we were at a cafe, which is one of the best in Cairo, wrote Flaubert a few months after his arrival in the capital, and where there were, at the same time as ourselves, inside, a donkey shitting and a gentleman who was pissing in a corner. No one finds that odd. No one says anything. And in Flaubert's eyes, they were right not to. Central to Flaubert's philosophy was the belief that we're not simply spiritual creatures, but also pissing and shitting ones, and that we should integrate the ramifications of this blunt idea into our view of the world. Flaubert found and welcomed in Egyptian culture a readiness to accept life's duality, shit, mind, life, death, purity, sexuality, madness, sanity. People belched to their heart's content in restaurants. A boy of 6 or 7, passing Flaubert in a Cairo street, cried out in greeting, "I wish you all kinds of prosperity, especially a long prick." 3. The exoticism of camels. One of the finest things is the camel, wrote Flaubert from Cairo. I never tire of watching this strange beast that lurches like a donkey and sways its neck like a swan. Their cry is something that I wear myself out trying to imitate. I hope to bring it back with me, but it's hard to reproduce, a rattle with a kind of tremulous gargling as an accompaniment. A few months after leaving Egypt, Flaubert wrote to a family friend, listing all that had most impressed him in the country: the pyramids, the temple at Karnak, the Valley of the Kings, some dancers in Cairo, a painter called Hassan el-Bilbais. "But my real passion is the camel," he wrote. "Please don't think I'm joking. Nothing has a more singular grace than this melancholic animal. You have to see them in the desert when they advance in single file against the horizon, like soldiers. Their necks stick out like those of ostriches, and they keep going, going." Why did Flaubert admire camels so much? He identified with their stoicism and ungainliness. He was touched by their sad expressions and the combination of awkwardness and fatalistic resilience. The people of Egypt seemed to share some of the qualities of the camel, a silent strength and humility that contrasted with the bourgeois arrogance of Flaubert's Normand neighbours. Flaubert had, since boyhood, resented the optimism of his country, a resentment expressed in Madame Bovary in the description of the cruel scientific faith of the most detestable character, the pharmacist Homais. And Flaubert held a predictably darker outlook. "At the end of the day, shit," he wrote. "With that mighty word, you can console yourself for all human miseries, so I enjoy repeating it. Shit, shit." It was a philosophy reflected in the sad, noble, yet slightly mischievous eyes of the Egyptian camel. When the time came for him to leave Egypt, Flaubert was distraught. "When will I see a palm tree again?" he asked. "When will I climb on a dromedary again?" And for the rest of his life he was to return constantly to the country in his mind. A few days before his death in 1880, he told his niece Caroline, "For the past 2 weeks I've been gripped by the longing to see a palm tree standing out against the blue sky, and to hear a stork clacking its beak at the top of a minaret." Flaubert's lifelong relationship with Egypt seems like an invitation to deepen and to respect our attractions to certain countries. From his adolescence onwards, Flaubert insisted that he wasn't French. His hatred of his country and its people was so profound it made a mockery of his civil status, and hence he proposed a new way of ascribing nationality, not according to the country one was born in or to which one's family belonged, but according to the places to which one was attracted. We have all, without choosing, been scattered at birth by the wind onto a country, but, like Flaubert, we're in adulthood granted the freedom imaginatively to recreate our identity in line with our true allegiances. When weary with our official nationality, as Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas put it, French. How proud one is to be French when one looks at the Colonne Vendôme. We may withdraw to the parts of ourselves that are more Bedouin than Normand, that delight in riding on a camel through a Khamsin, and in sitting in cafes beside shitting donkeys. When he was asked where he came from, Socrates said, not from Athens, but from the world. Flaubert was from Rouen, in his youthful account, a place drowning in merde, and where the good citizens wank themselves silly on a Sunday from boredom. And yet Abu Chanab, the father of the moustache, might have answered, perhaps a little from Egypt too. On Curiosity. In the springtime, I was invited to Madrid to attend a conference, which was scheduled to end on a Friday afternoon. Because I'd never visited the city before and had been told of its attractions on several occasions, I decided to extend my stay. My hosts had booked a room for me in a hotel on a wide tree-lined avenue in the southeastern part of the city. On the Friday evening, I retired early to bed. I had not revealed to my hosts that I'd be staying the weekend, for fear of forcing them into half-hearted hospitality from which neither side would benefit. But the decision also meant that I had to go without dinner, for I realized on walking back to the hotel that I was too shy to venture alone into any of the neighborhood restaurants, dark, wood-paneled places where I risked becoming an object of curiosity and pity. So I ate a packet of paprika-flavored crisps from the minibar, and, after watching the news on satellite television, fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, it was to an intense lethargy, as though my veins had become silted up with fine sugar or sand. On the desk lay several magazines offered by the hotel, with information on the city and 2 guidebooks that I had brought from home. In their different ways, they conspired to suggest that an exciting phenomenon called Madrid was waiting to be discovered outside, made up of monuments, churches, museums, fountains, plazas, and shopping streets. And yet these elements, about which I'd heard so much, and which I knew I was privileged to see, merely provoked in me a combination of listlessness and self-disgust at the contrast between my own indolence and what I imagined to be the eagerness of more normal visitors. My overwhelming wish was to remain in bed and, if possible, take an early flight home. In the summer of 1799, a 29-year-old German by the name of Alexander von Humboldt set sail from the Spanish port of La Coruña, bound for a voyage of exploration of the South American continent. From my earliest days, he later recalled, I'd felt the urge to travel to distant lands seldom visited by Europeans. The study of maps and the perusal of travel books aroused a secret fascination that was at times almost irresistible. The young German was ideally suited to follow up on his fascination. Along with great physical stamina, he had expertise in biology, geology, chemistry, physics, and history. As a student at the University of Göttingen, he'd befriended George Forster, the naturalist who had accompanied Captain Cook on his second voyage, and he'd mastered the art of classifying plant and animal species. Since finishing his studies, Humboldt had been looking for opportunities to travel, and in the spring of 1799, he had the good fortune to meet King Carlos IV of Spain, and persuade him to underwrite his exploration of South America. Humboldt was to be away from Europe for 5 years. On his return, he settled in Paris, and over the next 20 years published a 30-volume account of his travels, entitled Journey to the Equinoctial Regions of the New Continent. The length of the work was an accurate measure of Humboldt's achievements. Surveying these, Ralph Waldo Emerson was to write, Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, like the admirable Crichton, who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind, the force and range of the faculties, a universal man. Much about South America was still unknown to Europe when Humboldt set sail from La Coruña. Vespucci and Bougainville had travelled around the shores of the continent. La Condamine and Bouguer had surveyed the streams and mountains of the Amazon and of Peru. But there was still no accurate maps and little information on geology, botany, and the life of indigenous people. Humboldt transformed the state of knowledge. He travelled 15,000 kilometres around the northern coastlines and interior, and on the way collected 1,600 plants and identified 600 new species. He redrew the map of South America based on readings from accurate chronometers and sextants. He researched the Earth's magnetism and was the first man to discover that magnetic intensity declines the further one is from the poles. He gave the first account of the rubber and cinchona trees. He mapped the streams connecting the Orinoco and the Rio Negro river systems. He measured the effects of air pressure and altitude on vegetation. He studied the people of the Amazon basin. He compared the salinity of the water in the Pacific and Atlantic, and conceived of the idea of sea currents, recognizing that the temperature of the sea owes more to drifts than to latitude. Humboldt's early biographer, F. A. Schwarzenberg, subtitled his life of Humboldt, "What May Be Accomplished in a Lifetime," and summarized the areas of his extraordinary curiosity. 1. The knowledge of the earth and its inhabitants. 2. The discovery of the higher laws of nature which govern the universe, men, animals, plants, and minerals. 3. The discovery of new forms of life. 4. The discovery of territories hitherto but imperfectly known and their various productions. 5. The acquaintance with new species of the human race, their manners, language, and historical traces of their culture. What may be accomplished in a lifetime, and seldom or never is. It was a maid who was eventually responsible for my voyage of exploration around Madrid. 3 times she burst into my room with a broom and basket of cleaning fluids, and, at the sight of a huddled shape in the sheets, exclaimed with theatrical alarm, "Hola, perdone," before leaving again, taking care to let her utensils collide loudly with the door as she slammed it. Because I didn't wish to encounter this apparition a 4th time, I dressed, ordered a hot chocolate and a plate of batter sticks in the hotel bar, and made my way to a part of town identified by one of my guidebooks as Old Madrid. When Philip II chose Madrid as his capital in 1561, the guidebook explained, it was a small Castilian town with a population of barely 20,000. In the following years, it was to grow into the nerve center of a mighty empire. Narrow streets with houses and medieval churches began to grow up behind the old Moorish fortress, which was later replaced by a Gothic palace and, eventually, by the present-day Bourbon Palace, the Palacio Real. The 16th century city is known as the Madrid de las Austrias, after the Habsburg dynasty. At this time, monasteries were endowed and churches and palaces were built. In the 17th century, the Plaza Mayor was added, and the Puerta del Sol became the spiritual and geographical heart of Spain. I stood on the corner of the Cala de Carretas and the Puerta del Sol, an undistinguished half-moon-shaped junction, in the middle of which Carlos III sat astride a horse. It was a sunny day, and the crowds of tourists were stopping to take photographs and listen to guides. And I wondered with mounting anxiety, what was I to do here? What was I to think? Humboldt had not been pursued by such questions. Everywhere he went, his mission was unambiguous, to discover facts and to carry out experiments in order to do so. Already on the ship carrying him to South America, he'd begun his factual researches. He measured the temperature of the sea every 2 hours from Spain to Venezuela. He took readings from his sextant and recorded the different marine species that he found in a net he'd hung from the rear of the ship. And once he'd landed in Venezuela, he threw himself into study of the vegetation around Cumana. The hills of rock on which the town stood were covered in candle-like cacti and opuntia, their trunks branching out like candelabras. One afternoon, Humboldt measured a cactus, as it's known in biology, tuna macho, and noted its circumference. It was 1.54 meters. Humboldt spent 3 weeks measuring plants on the coast, then ventured inland into the jungle-covered New Andalusia mountains. He took with him a mule bearing a trunk with a sextant, a dipping needle, an instrument to measure magnetic variation, a thermometer, and Saussure's hygrometer, which measured humidity and was made of hair and whalebone. He put the instruments to good use. In his journal he wrote, "As we entered the jungle, the barometer showed that we were gaining altitude. Here the tree trunks offered us an extraordinary view. A gramineous plant with verticillate branches climbs like a liana to a height of 8 to 10 feet, forming garlands that cross our path and swing in the wind. At about 3 in the afternoon, we stopped on a small plain known as Quetepe, some 190 toises above sea level. A few huts stand by a spring, whose water is known by the Indians to be fresh and healthy. We found the water delicious. Its temperature was only 22.5 degrees centigrade, while the air was 28.7 degrees centigrade. But in Madrid, everything was already well known. Everything had already been measured. The northern side of the Plaza Mayor was 101 meters and 52 centimeters long. It was built by Juan Gómez de Mora in 1619. The temperature was 18.5 centigrade, the wind was from the west. The equestrian statue of Philip III in the middle of the Plaza Mayor was 5 meters and 43 centimeters high, and had been crafted by Giambologna and Pietro Tacca. The guidebook occasionally seemed impatient in presenting its facts. It sent me to the Pontificia de San Miguel, a grey building designed to repel the casual glances of passers-by, and declared, "The Basilica, by Bonavia, is one of the rare Spanish churches to have been inspired by the 18th century Italian Baroque. Its convex facade, designed as an interplay of inward and outward curves, is adorned with fine statues. Above the doorway is a low relief of Saints Justus and Pastor, to whom the basilica was previously dedicated. The interior is graceful and elegant, with an oval cupola intersecting ribbed vaulting, flowing cornices, and abundant stucco work." If my level of curiosity was so far removed from Humboldt's, and my impulse to return to bed so strong, it was in part because of the range of advantages with which any traveller on a factual as opposed to touristic mission is blessed. Facts have utility. Measuring the dimensions of the north face of the Plaza Mayor will prove useful to architects and students of the work of Juan Gómez de Mora. Knowledge of the barometric pressure on an April day in central Madrid will be useful to meteorologists. Humboldt's discovery that the circumference of the Cumanan cactus, Juna macho, was 1.54 meters, was of interest to biologists throughout Europe, who had not suspected that cacti could grow so large. And, with utility comes an approving audience. When Humboldt returned to Europe with his South American facts in August 1804, he was besieged and feted by interested parties. 6 weeks after arriving in Paris, he read his first travel report before a packed audience at the Institut National. He opened 20 cases of specimens, and many pressed around the podium to see them. The Bureau of Longitude Studies asked for a copy of his astronomic facts, the observatory for his barometric measurements. He was invited to dinner by Chateaubriand and Madame de Staël, and admitted to the elite scientific society of Arcueil. In Britain his work was read by Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. Charles Darwin learnt large parts of his findings by heart. As he walked around a cactus or stuck his thermometer in the Amazon, Humboldt's own curiosity must have been guided by a sense of others' interests, and bolstered by it in the inevitable moments when lethargy or sickness threatened. It was fortunate for him that almost every existing fact about South America was either wrong or questionable. When he sailed into Havana in November 1800, Humboldt discovered that even this most important strategic base for the Spanish Navy had not been placed correctly on the map. He unpacked his measuring instruments and worked out the correct geographical latitude. A grateful Spanish admiral invited him to dinner. The danger of travel is that we see things at the wrong time, before we've had a chance to build up a necessary receptivity, and when new information is therefore as useless and fugitive as necklace beads without a connecting chain. The risk is compounded by geography, the way that cities contain buildings or monuments that are only a few feet apart in space, but leagues apart in terms of what would be required to appreciate them. Having made a journey to a place we may never revisit, we feel obliged to admire a sequence of things without any connection to one another besides a geographic one, a proper understanding of which would require qualities unlikely to be found in the same person. We're asked to be curious about Gothic architecture on one street, and then, promptly, Etruscan archaeology on the next. The visitor to Madrid is asked to be interested in both the Palacio Real, an 18th-century royal residence famed for its chambers decorated with lavish Rococo chinoiserie by the Neapolitan designer Gasparini, and, a few moments later, the Centro de Arte Reina Sofia, a whitewashed gallery devoted to 20th-century art, whose highlight is Picasso's Guernica. Yet the natural progression for someone deepening their appreciation of 18th-century royal architecture would be to ignore the gallery and head for the royal palaces of Prague and St. Petersburg instead. Travel twists our curiosity according to a superficial geographical logic, as superficial as if a university course were to prescribe books according to their size rather than subject matter. Towards the end of his life, his South American adventures long behind him, Humboldt complained, with a mixture of self-pity and pride. People often say that I'm curious about too many things at once. Botany, astronomy, comparative anatomy. But can you really forbid a man from harboring a desire to know and embrace everything which surrounds him? We cannot, of course, forbid him. A pat on the back feels more appropriate. But perhaps admiration for his journey does not preclude a degree of sympathy for those who, in fascinating cities, have occasionally been visited by a strong wish to remain in bed and take the next flight home. On the country and the city. I had arranged to meet M at Euston Station, and we travelled by an afternoon train up the spine of England to arrive at Oxenholme Station, subtitled The Lake District, shortly before 9. Only a few others alighted with us, and we walked silently along the platform, our breaths visible in the night chill. The station was deserted, though it couldn't always have been thus, for many of the signs were translated into Japanese. The immediate motives for our journey were personal, but they could also have been said to belong to a broader historical movement dating back to the second half of the 18th century, in which city dwellers began for the first time to travel in great numbers through the countryside, in an attempt to restore health to their bodies and, more importantly, harmony to their souls. In 1700, 17% of the population of England and Wales lived in a town. In 1850, it was 50%. By 1900, 75. We headed towards the village of Troutbeck, a few miles above Lake Windermere, to an inn called the Mortal Man. The landlord welcomed us to the Lake District and promised us 3 days of perfect weather. I had come in part because of a poet. That evening in the room, I read another section of Wordsworth's Prelude. M declared him an old toad and went to have a bath, though later she recited several lines from his Ode, Intimations of Immortality, which she said had moved her perhaps more than anything she'd ever read. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight, though nothing can bring back the hour of splendour in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind. William Wordsworth was born in 1770 in Cockermouth, on the northern edge of the Lake District. He spent, in his words, half his boyhood in running wild among the mountains, and, aside from interludes in London and Cambridge and travels around Europe, lived his whole life in the Lake District, first in a modest stone dwelling, Dove Cottage, in the village of Grasmere, and then, as his fame increased, in a more substantial home in nearby Rydal. And almost every day Wordsworth went on a long walk. He was unbothered by the rain, which, as he admitted, tended to fall in the Lake District, with a vigour and perseverance that may remind the disappointed traveller of those deluges of rain which fall among the Abyssinian mountains for the annual supply of the Nile. Wordsworth's acquaintance, Thomas de Quincey, estimated that Wordsworth had walked 180,000 miles in his life. All the more remarkable, added de Quincey, given Wordsworth's physique. For the poet was, he wrote, upon the whole not a well-made man. His legs were pointedly condemned by all the female connoisseurs in legs that I've ever heard lecture upon the topic. Sadly, continued de Quincey, the total effect of Wordsworth's person was always worst in a state of motion, for, according to the remark I've heard from many country people, he walked like a cade being some sort of insect which advances by an oblique motion. It was during his cadish walks that Wordsworth derived the inspiration for many of his poems, including To a Butterfly, To the Cuckoo, To a Skylark, To the Daisy, and To the Small Celandine, poems about natural phenomena which poets had hitherto looked at casually or ritualistically, but which Wordsworth now declared to be the noblest subjects of his craft. On the 16th of March, 1802, according to the journal of his sister Dorothy, a record of her siblings' movements around the Lake District, Wordsworth walked across a bridge at Brothers Water, a placid lake near Patterdale, then sat down to write the following. The cock is crowing, the stream is flowing, the small birds twitter, the lake doth glitter, there's joy in the mountains, there's life in the fountain, small clouds are sailing, blue sky prevailing. A few weeks afterwards, the poet found himself moved to write by the beauty of a sparrow's nest. Look, 5 blue eggs are gleaming there, few visions have I seen more fair, nor many prospects of delight more pleasing than that simple sight. A need to express joy that Wordsworth experienced again a few summers later on hearing the sound of a nightingale. O nightingale, thou surely art a creature of a fiery heart. Thou sing'st as if the god of wine had helped thee to a valentine. These poems were not haphazard articulations of pleasure. Behind them lay a well-developed philosophy of nature, which, infusing all of Wordsworth's work, made an original and, in the history of Western thought, hugely influential claim about our requirements for happiness and the origins of our unhappiness. The poet proposed that nature, which he took to comprise, among other elements, birds, streams, daffodils, and sheep, was an indispensable corrective to the psychological damage inflicted by life in the city. The message met with vicious initial resistance. Lord Byron, reviewing Wordsworth's poems in 2 volumes in 1807, was bewildered at how a grown man could make such claims on behalf of flowers and animals. Byron wrote, "What will any reader out of the nursery say to such namby-pamby, an imitation of such minstrelsy as soothed our cries in the cradle?" The Edinburgh Review sympathized, declaring Wordsworth's poetry a piece of babyish absurdity, and saying, "All the world laughs at elegiac stanzas to a sucking pig, a hymn on washing day, sonnets to one's grandmother, or Pindaric odes on gooseberry pie. And yet it seems it's not easy to convince Mr. Wordsworth of this. Parodies of the poet's work began to circulate in the literary journals. "When I see a cloud, I think out loud how lovely it is to see the sky like this," ran one. "Was it a robin that I saw? Was it a pigeon or a daw?" ran another. Wordsworth was unbothered. "Trouble not yourself upon the present reception of these poems," he advised Lady Beaumont. "Of what moment is that, when compared with what I trust is their destiny, to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight, by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think and feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. This is their office, which I trust they will faithfully perform long after we, that is, all that is mortal of us, are moulded in our graves." Wordsworth was wrong only about how long this would take. "Up to 1820, the name of Wordsworth was trampled underfoot," explained De Quincey. "From 1820 to 1830, it was militant, and from 1830 to 1835, it has been triumphant." Taste underwent a radical transformation. The reading public ceased guffawing and learnt to be charmed and even recite by heart hymns to butterflies and sonnets on celandines. Wordsworth's poetry attracted tourists to the places that had inspired it. New hotels were opened in Windermere, Rydal and Grasmere. By 1845, it was estimated that there were more tourists in the Lake District than sheep. They prized glimpses of the Cadish creature in his garden in Rydal, and on hillsides and lake shores sought out the sights whose power he had described in verse. In 1843, Wordsworth was appointed Poet Laureate. Plans were drawn up by a group of well-wishers to have the whole Lake District renamed Wordsworthshire. By the time of his death at the age of 80 in 1850, serious critical opinion seemed almost universally sympathetic to Wordsworth's suggestion that regular travel through nature was a necessary antidote to the evils of the city. Part of Wordsworth's complaint was directed towards the smoke, congestion, poverty, and ugliness of cities. But clean air bills and slum clearance would not by themselves have eradicated Wordsworth's critique. For it was the effect of cities on our souls rather than on our health that concerned him. The poet accused cities of fostering a family of life-destroying emotions: anxiety about our position in the social hierarchy, envy at the success of others, pride and a desire to shine in the eyes of strangers. City dwellers had no perspective, he alleged. They were enthralled to what was spoken of in the street or at the dinner table. However well provided for, they had a relentless desire for new things, which they didn't genuinely lack and on which happiness didn't depend. And in this crowded, anxious sphere, it seemed harder than on an isolated homestead to begin sincere relationships with others. It was while afflicted by a few of these ills that, several months before my journey to the Lake District, I emerged from a gathering held in the centre of London, that turbulent world of men and things, as Wordsworth wrote in the prelude. Walking away from the venue, envious and concerned about my position, I found myself deriving unexpected relief from the sight of a vast object overhead, which, despite the darkness, I attempted to photograph with a pocket camera, and which served to bring home, as rarely before, the redemptive power of natural forces with which so much of Wordsworth's poetry was concerned. The cloud, with the strong westerly wind, was not destined to remain long. The lights of surrounding offices lent to its edges an almost decadent fluorescent orange glow, and yet its granite-grey centre testified to its origins in the interplay of air and sea. Soon the cloud would be over the fields of Essex, then the marshes and oil refineries, before heading out over the mutinous North Sea waves. Keeping my eyes fixed on this apparition while walking towards the bus stop, I felt my anxieties abate, and turned over in my mind words that the Cadish poet had once composed in honour of a Welsh valley. Nature can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life, shall e'er prevail against us, or disturb our cheerful faith that all which we behold is full of blessings. In the summer of 1798, Wordsworth and his sister went on a walking holiday along the Wye Valley in Wales, where William had a moment of revelation about the power of nature, which was to resonate through his poetry for the rest of his life. It was Wordsworth's second visit to the valley. He'd walked along it 5 years before, and in the intervening period, he'd gone through a succession of unhappy experiences. He'd spent time in London, a city he feared. He'd altered his political views by reading Godwin. He'd transformed his sense of a poet's mission through his friendship with Coleridge, and he'd travelled across a revolutionary France wrecked by Robespierre's Great Terror. Back by the Wye, Wordsworth found an elevated spot, sat under a sycamore tree, looked out across the valley and its river, cliffs, hedgerows, and forests, and was inspired to write perhaps his greatest poem, lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, subtitled On Revisiting the Banks of the Wye During a Tour, July 13th, 1798, an ode to the restorative powers of nature. Though absent long, these forms of beauty have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms, and amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet with tranquil restoration. The dichotomy of town and country formed a backbone to Wordsworth's poem, the latter repeatedly invoked as a counter to the pernicious influence of the former. How oft, in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable, and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft, in spirit, have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee? An expression of gratitude that was to recur in the prelude, where the poet once more acknowledged his debt to nature, for allowing him to dwell in cities without succumbing to the base emotions he held they habitually fostered. If, mingling with the world, I am content with my own modest pleasures, and have lived removed from little enmities and low desires, the gift is yours, ye winds and sounding cataracts, 'tis yours, ye mountains, thine, O nature. Why? Why would proximity to a cataract, a mountain, or any other part of nature render a person less likely to experience enmities and low desires than proximity to crowded streets? The Lake District offered some suggestions. Em and I rose early on our first morning, and went down to the mortal man's breakfast room, which was painted pink and overlooked a luxuriant valley. It was raining heavily, but the landlord assured us that this was but a passing shower. Having eaten, we drove to Ambleside, where we bought a few items to take with us on a walk: a compass, a waterproof map holder, water, chocolate, and some sandwiches. Though small, Ambleside had the bustle of a metropolis. Lorries were noisily unloading outside shops, there were placards everywhere advertising restaurants and hotels, and though it was still early, the tea shops were full. On racks outside newsagents, the papers carried the latest development in a political scandal in London. But a few miles northwest of the town, in the great Langdale Valley, the situation was transformed. For the first time since arriving in the Lake District, we were in deep countryside, where nature was more in evidence than humans. On either side of the path stood oak trees. Each one grew far from the shadow of its neighbour, in fields so appetizing to sheep that they had eaten them down to a perfect lawn. The oaks were of noble bearing. They didn't trail their branches on the ground like willows, nor did their leaves have the dishevelled appearance of certain poplars, which can look from close up as though they've been awoken in the middle of the night without time to fix their hair. The oaks gathered their lower branches tightly under themselves, while their upper branches grew in small, orderly steps, producing a rich green foliage in an almost perfect circle. The rain, which continued to fall despite the promises of the landlord, gave us a sense of the mass of the oaks. Standing under their damp canopy, rain could be heard falling on 40,000 leaves. The trees were an image of ordered complexity. The roots patiently drew nutrients from the soil. The capillaries of their trunks sent water 25 meters upwards. Each branch took enough for the needs of its own leaves. Each leaf contributed to the maintenance of the whole. The trees were an image of patience too, for they would sit out this rainy morning and the many that would follow it without complaint, adjusting themselves to the slow shift of the seasons, showing no ill temper in a storm, content to keep their many slender fingers deep in the clammy soil. Wordsworth enjoyed sitting beneath oaks, listening to the rain or watching sunbeams fracture across their leaves. What he saw as the patience and dignity of the trees struck him as characteristic of nature's works, which were to be valued for holding up, in his words, before the mind intoxicate with present objects, and a busy dance of things that pass away, a temperate show of objects that endure. Nature would, Wordsworth proposed, dispose us to seek out in life and in each other whate'er there is desirable and good. She was, as he put it, an image of right reason that could temper the crooked impulses of urban life. To accept even in part Wordsworth's argument may require that we accept a prior principle, that our identities are, to a greater or lesser extent, malleable, that we change according to whom and sometimes what we're with. The company of certain people excites our generosity and sensitivity, of others our competitiveness and envy. What may then be expected to occur to a person's identity in the company of a cataract or a mountain, an oak tree or a celandine, objects which, after all, have no conscious concerns, and so, it would seem, cannot either encourage or censor behaviour? And yet, an inanimate object may, to come to the linchpin of Wordsworth's claim for the beneficial effects of nature, still work an influence on those around it. Natural scenes have the power to suggest certain values to us: oaks, dignity; pines, resolution; lakes, calm, and so in unobtrusive ways may therefore act as inspirations to virtue. In a letter written to a young student in the summer of 1802, while discussing the task of poetry, Wordsworth came close to specifying the values he felt that nature embodied. As he wrote, "A great poet ought to a certain degree to rectify men's feelings, to render their feelings more sane, pure and permanent, in short, more consonant to nature." In every natural landscape, Wordsworth found instances of this sanity, purity, and permanence. Flowers were, for example, models of humility and meekness. As he put it in his poem, To the Daisy, "Sweet silent creature, that breathest with me in sun and air, do thou, as thou art wont, repair my heart with gladness, and a share of thy meek nature. Animals were models of stoicism. Wordsworth became attached to a blue tit, who, even in the worst weather, sang in his orchard above Dove Cottage. During their first freezing winter there, he and Dorothy were inspired by a pair of swans, who endured the cold with greater patience than they. An hour up the Langdale Valley, the rain having abated, Em and I hear a faint seep, rapidly repeated, alternating with a louder tissip. 3 meadow pipits are flying out of a patch of rough grass. A black-eared wheat-ear is looking pensive on a conifer branch, warming its pale, sandy buff feathers in the late summer sun. Stirred by something, it takes off and circles the valley, releasing a rapid and high-pitched shver shvi shvi oo. The sound has no effect on the many sheep dotted over the valley floor. One of the sheep ambles towards the path and looks curiously at his visitors. Humans and sheep stare at one another in wonder. After a moment, the sheep sits down and takes a lazy mouthful of grass. A few meters ahead, inside a deep green bush that runs down to a stream, we hear a noise like that of a lethargic old man clearing his throat. It's followed by an incongruously frantic rustle. But, on noticing it has company, the creature falls silent. One of Wordsworth's poetic ambitions was to lead us to see the number of animals living alongside us, who we typically ignore. Shadowy, generic presences. The bird up on the steeple, the rustling creature in the bush. He invited his readers to abandon their usual perspectives, and to consider for a time how the world might look through other eyes, to shuttle between the human and the natural perspective. Why might this be interesting, or even inspiring? A few days before travelling to the Lake District, I'd come upon a 19th century book that discussed Wordsworth's interest in birds, and in its preface hinted at the benefits of the alternative perspective they offered. It read, "I'm sure it would give much pleasure to many of the public if the local daily and weekly press throughout this country would always record not only the arrivals and departures of lords, ladies, MPs, and the great people of this land, but also the arrivals and departures of birds." If we're pained by the values of the age or of the elite, it can be a source of relief to come upon reminders of the diversity of life on the planet. To hold in mind that alongside the business of the great people of the land, there are also pipits seeping in meadows. Looking back on Wordsworth's early poems, Coleridge proposed that their genius had been to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural, by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom, and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us, an inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Nature's loveliness might in turn, proposed Wordsworth, encourage us to locate the good in ourselves. 2 people standing on the edge of a rock overlooking a stream and a grand wooded valley might transform their relationship not just with nature, but, as significantly, with one another. There are concerns which seem indecent when in the company of a cliff, others to which cliffs naturally lend their assistance, their majesty encouraging the steady and high-minded in ourselves, their size teaching us to respect with good grace and an awed humility all that surpasses us. It is of course possible to feel envy for a colleague before a mighty cataract. It's just, if the Wordsworthian message is to be believed, a little more unlikely. Wordsworth argued that, through a life spent in nature, his character had been shaped to resist competition, envy, and anxiety. And so in his poetry he celebrated that first I looked at man through objects that were great or fair, first communed with him by their help, and thus was founded a sure safeguard and defence against the weight of meanness, selfish cares, coarse manners, vulgar passions that beat in on all sides from the ordinary world in which we traffic. Em and I were unable to spend long in the Lake District. 3 days after our arrival, we were back on the London train, seated opposite a man who made calls on his mobile phone, in a vain search, the carriage learnt during conversations extended across many fields and industrial cities, for someone called Jim who owed him money. Even if we accept how beneficial contact with nature might be, its influence must surely be limited by its brevity. 3 days in nature can scarcely be expected to work a psychological effect for longer than a few hours. Wordsworth was less pessimistic. In the autumn of 1790, the poet went on a walking tour of the Alps. He travelled from Geneva to the Vale of Chamonix, then crossed the Simplon Pass and descended through the ravine of Gondo to Lake Maggiore. In a letter to his sister, Wordsworth wrote, "At this moment, when many of these landscapes are floating before my mind, I feel a high enjoyment in reflecting that perhaps scarce a day of my life will pass in which I shall not derive some happiness from these images." This was no hyperbole. Decades later, the Alps continued to live within Wordsworth, and strengthened him whenever he evoked them. Their survival led him to argue that we may witness in nature certain scenes that stay with us throughout our lives, and every time they enter consciousness, can offer us a contrast to and relief from present difficulties. Wordsworth termed such experiences in nature spots of time. There are in our existence spots of time that with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue that penetrates, enables us to mount when high, more high, and lifts us up when fallen. Such a belief in small, critical moments in nature explains Wordsworth's unusually specific way of subtitling many of his poems. Tintern Abbey's subtitle, on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798, included the exact day, month, and year, to suggest that a few moments in the countryside, overlooking a valley, could number among the most momentous and useful of one's whole life, and as worthy of being remembered precisely as a birthday or a wedding. I too was granted a spot of time. It occurred in the late afternoon on the second day of the visit to the Lake District. Em and I were sitting on a bench near Ambleside eating chocolate bars. We'd exchanged a few words about the chocolate bars we preferred. Then we fell silent, and I looked out across a field to a clump of trees by a stream. There were a host of different colours in the trees, sharp gradations of green, like someone had fanned out samples from a colour chart. These trees gave off an impression of astonishing health and exuberance. They seemed not to care that the world was old and often sad. I was tempted to bury my face in them, so as to be restored by their smell. It seemed extraordinary that nature could, on its own, without any concern for the happiness of two people eating chocolate on a bench, have come up with a scene so utterly suited to a human sense of beauty and proportion. My receptivity to the scene lasted only a minute. Thoughts of work then intruded, and Em suggested we return to the inn so she could make a phone call. I was unaware of having fixed the scene in memory, until, one afternoon in London, while waiting in a traffic jam, oppressed by cares, the trees came back to me, pushing aside a raft of meetings and unanswered correspondence, and asserting themselves in consciousness. I was carried away from the traffic and the crowds, and returned to trees whose names I didn't know, but which I could see as clearly as if they'd stood before me. These trees provided a ledge against which I could rest my thoughts. They protected me from the eddies of anxiety, and, in a small way that afternoon, contributed a reason to be alive. At 11 in the morning, on the 15th of April 1802, Wordsworth saw some daffodils along the western shore of Ullswater Lake, a few miles north of where Em and I had stayed. There were some 10,000 of these flowers dancing in the breeze, he wrote. The waves of the lake seemed to dance beside them too, though the daffodils outdid the sparkling waves in glee. What wealth the show to me had brought, Wordsworth explained of a moment that became a spot of time. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. The consoling idea that in the city's turbulent world we may also draw on our images of our travels through nature, and with their help blunt a little the forces of enmity and low desires. On eye-opening art. One summer I was invited to spend a few days with friends in a farmhouse in Provence. I knew that the word Provence was for many people rich in associations, though it meant little to me. I tended to switch off at its mention, out of a sense, founded on little, that the place wouldn't really be congenial to me. What I did know was that Provence was generally held by sensible people to be very beautiful. Ah, Provence, they would sigh, with a reverence otherwise reserved for opera or Delft earthenware. I flew to Marseille, and after renting a small Renault, headed for the home of my hosts, which lay at the foot of the Alpes hills, between the towns of Arles and Saint-Rémy. At the exit out of Marseille, I grew confused and ended up at the giant oil refinery at Fos-sur-Mer, whose tangle of pipes and cooling towers spoke of the complexity in the manufacture of a liquid that I was used to putting into my car without dwelling on its origins. I found my way back to the N568, which led me inland across the wheat-growing plain of La Crau. Outside the village of Saint-Martin-de-Crau, a few miles from my destination, being too early, I pulled off the road on the edge of an olive grove. It was quiet save for the sounds of cicadas hidden in the trees. Behind the grove were wheat fields bordered by a row of cypresses, and over their tops rose the irregular ridge of the Alpes. The sky was a cloudless blue. I scanned the view. I was not looking for anything in particular. My motive was simple and hedonistic. I was looking for beauty. Delight and enliven me was my implicit challenge to the olive trees, cypresses, and skies of Provence. It was a vast, loose agenda, and my eyes were bewildered at their freedom. Without the motives that had marked the rest of the day, to seek out the car rental desk, the exit out of Marseille, and so on, my eyes careered from object to object in random, impatient patterns. Though the landscape was not ugly, I couldn't, after a few moments of scrutiny, detect the charm which had often been ascribed to it. The olive trees looked stunted, more like bushes than trees, and the wheat fields evoked the flat, dull fields of southeastern England, where I'd attended a school and been unhappy. I lacked the energy to register the barns, the limestone of the hills, or the poppies growing at the feet of a group of cypresses. Bored and uncomfortable in the Renault's increasingly hot plastic interior, I set off for my destination, and greeted my hosts with a remark that this was simply paradise. Because we find places to be beautiful as immediately and apparently spontaneously as we find snow to be cold or sugar sweet, it's hard to imagine that there's anything we could do to alter or expand our attractions. It seems that matters have been decided for us by qualities inherent in places, or by hard wiring in our psyches, and that we would therefore be as helpless to alter our sense of the places we find beautiful as of the ice creams we find appetizing. Yet aesthetic tastes may be less rigid than the analogy suggests. We overlook certain places because nothing has ever prompted us to conceive of them as worthy of appreciation, or an unfortunate but random association has turned us against them. Our relationship to olive trees can be improved by being directed towards the silver in their leaves or the structure of their branches. New associations can be created around wheat once we're directed to the pathos of this fragile and yet essential crop bending its grain-filled heads in the wind. We may find something to appreciate in the skies of Provence once we're told, even if only in the crudest way, that it's the shade of blue that counts. And perhaps the most effective way in which our sense of what to look for in a scene can be enriched is through visual art. We could conceive of many works of art as immensely subtle instruments for telling us what amounts in effect to, look at the sky of Provence, redraw your notion of wheat, do justice to olive trees. From amidst the million things in, for example, a wheat field, a successful painting will draw out the features from which a sense of beauty and interest can be made to arise in a spectator. The painting will foreground elements ordinarily lost in the mass of data. It will stabilize these, and, once we're acquainted with them, prompt us, imperceptibly, to find them in the world about us, or, if we've already found them, lend us confidence to give them weight in our lives. We'll be like a person around whom a word has been mentioned on many occasions, but who only begins to hear it once he's learnt its meaning. And insofar as we travel in search of beauty, works of art may, in small ways, start to influence where we would like to travel to. Vincent van Gogh arrived in Provence at the end of February 1888. He was 35 years old and had devoted himself to painting only 8 years before, after failing in attempts to become first a teacher and then a priest. For the previous 2 years, Van Gogh had been living in Paris with his brother Theo, an art dealer who supported him financially. He'd had little artistic training, but had befriended Paul Gauguin and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and exhibited his work along with theirs at the Café du Tambourin on the Boulevard de Clichy. I can still remember vividly how excited I became that winter when travelling from Paris to Arles, recalled Van Gogh of the 16-hour train journey to Provence. On arrival in Arles, the most prosperous town in the region and a centre for the olive trade and railway engineering, Van Gogh carried his bags in the snow, an exceptional 10 inches had fallen that day, to the small Hôtel Carrel, not far from the northern ramparts of the town. Despite the weather and the small size of his room, Van Gogh was enthusiastic about his southerly move. As he told his sister, "I believe that life here is just a little more satisfying than in many other spots." Van Gogh was to remain in Arles until May 1889, 15 months during which he produced approximately 200 paintings, 100 drawings and 200 letters, a period generally agreed to have been his greatest. Van Gogh's earliest works from Provence show Arles lying under snow, the sky a limpid blue, the earth a frozen pink. 5 weeks after he arrived, spring came, and he painted 14 canvases of trees in bloom in the fields outside Arles. At the beginning of May, he painted the Langlois drawbridge over the Arles-Bouc Canal on the south side of Arles, and at the end of the month he produced a number of views from the plain of La Crau, looking towards the Alpes hills and the ruined abbey of Montmajour. He also painted the reverse scene, climbing the rocky slopes of the abbey for a view of Arles. By the middle of June, his attention had shifted to a new subject, the harvest, of which he completed 10 paintings in only 2 weeks. He worked with extraordinary speed, As he put it, quickly, 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 and in a hurry, just like a harvester who is silent under the blazing sun, intent only on his reaping. I work even in the middle of the day, in the full sunshine, and I enjoy it like a cicada. My God, if I'd only known this country at the age of 25, instead of coming here when I was 35 years old. Later, explaining to his brother why he'd moved from Paris to Arles, Van Gogh offered 2 reasons. Firstly, because he'd wanted to paint the South, and secondly, because he'd wanted, through his work, to help other people to see it. However unsure Van Gogh was of his own powers to do this, he never wavered in his faith that the project was theoretically possible. That is, that artists could paint a portion of the world and in consequence open the eyes of other people to it. If he had such faith in the eye-opening power of art, it was because he'd often experienced it as a spectator. Since moving to France from his native Holland, he'd felt it particularly in relation to literature. He'd read the works of Balzac, Flaubert, Zola, and Maupassant, and felt grateful to them for opening his eyes to the dynamics of French society and psychology. Madame Bovary had taught him about provincial middle-class life, and Père Goriot about penniless, ambitious students in Paris, and he now recognized the characters from these novels in society at large. Paintings had similarly opened his eyes. Van Gogh frequently paid tribute to painters who'd allowed him to see certain colors and atmospheres. Velázquez, for example, had given him a map that allowed him to see grey. Several of Velázquez's canvases depicted humble Iberian interiors, where the walls were made of brick or a sombre plaster, and where, in the middle of the day, when the shutters were closed to protect the house from the heat, the dominant color was a sepulchral grey, occasionally pierced, where the shutters had not quite been closed, by a brilliant yellow shaft. Velázquez had not invented such effects. Many would have witnessed them before him, but few had had the energy or talent to capture them and turn them into communicable experience. Like an explorer with a new continent, Velázquez had, for Van Gogh at least, given his name to a discovery in the world of light. Van Gogh ate in many small restaurants in the centre of Arles. The walls were often dark, the shutters were closed, and the sunlight outside was bright. One lunchtime, he wrote to his brother, explaining that he'd stumbled upon something utterly Velázquezian. "This restaurant where I am is very strange," he wrote. "It's grey all over, a Velázquez grey, like in the Spinning Women, and even the very narrow, very fierce ray of sunlight through a blind, like the one that slants across Velázquez's picture, is not missing. In the kitchen there's an old woman and a short, fat servant, also in grey, black, white. It's pure Velázquez." It was for Van Gogh the mark of every great painter to allow us to see certain aspects of the world more clearly. If Velázquez was his guide to grey and the coarse faces of large cooks, then Monet was his guide to sunsets, Rembrandt to morning light, and Vermeer to the adolescent girls of Arles. The sky over the Rhone after a heavy rain shower reminded him of Hokusai, the wheat of Millet, and the young women in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer of Cimabue and Giotto. However, fortunately for his artistic ambitions, Van Gogh did not believe that previous artists had captured everything there was to see in southern France. Many had, in his view, completely missed the essentials. "Good Lord," he exclaimed, "I've seen things by certain painters which didn't do justice to the subject at all. There's plenty for me to work on here." No one had, for example, captured the distinctive appearance of the middle-aged, middle-class women of Arles. He noted that there are some women like a Fragonard and some like a Renoir, but there are some that can't be labelled with anything that's ever been done yet in painting. The farm labourers he saw working in the fields outside Arles had also been ignored by artists. He wrote, "Millet has reawakened our thoughts so that we can see the dweller in nature, but until now no one has painted the real southern Frenchman for us. Have we in general learned to see the peasant now? No, hardly anyone knows how to pull one off. The Provence that greeted Van Gogh in 1888 had been the subject of painting for over 100 years. Among the better-known Provençal artists were Fragonard, Constantin, Bidot, Granet, and Aiguier. All were realistic painters, adhering to the classical, and until then relatively undisputed notion that their task was to render on canvas an accurate version of the visual world. They went out into the fields and mountains of Provence and painted recognizable versions of cypresses, trees, grass, wheat, clouds, and bulls. Yet Van Gogh insisted that most had failed to do justice to their subjects. They had not, he claimed, produced realistic depictions of Provence. We are apt to call any painting realistic that competently conveys key elements of the world. But the world is actually complex enough for two realistic pictures of the same place to look very different, depending on an artist's style and temperament. Every realistic picture represents a choice of which features of reality are given prominence. No painting ever captures the whole, as Nietzsche mockingly pointed out in a piece of doggerel verse. The realistic painter. Completely true to nature, what a lie! How could nature ever be constrained into a picture? The smallest bit of nature is infinite, and so he paints what he likes about it. And what does he like? He likes what he can paint. If we in turn like the painter's work, it's perhaps because we judge that he or she has selected those features that we believe to be the most valuable about a scene. There are selections so acute that they come to define a place. We can no longer travel through it without being reminded of what a great artist noticed there. Alternatively, if we complain that, for example, a portrait of us doesn't look like us, we're not accusing a painter of trickery. We simply feel that the process of selection that goes on in any work of art has gone wrong, and that parts of us which we think of as belonging to our essential selves have not been given their due. Bad art could be defined as a series of bad choices about what to show and what to leave out. And leaving the essential out was precisely Van Gogh's complaint against most of the artists who had painted southern France until his own day. There was a large book on Van Gogh in the guest bedroom in Provence, and on my first night I read several chapters, eventually falling asleep as a trace of dawn red appeared in the window. I awoke late and found my hosts had gone to Saint-Rémy and would be back at lunchtime. Breakfast was laid out on a table on the terrace. It was a clear day with a mistral blowing, which ruffled the heads of the wheat in an adjacent field. I'd sat in this spot the day before, but only now did I notice that there were two large cypresses growing at the end of the garden. Van Gogh had sketched a series of cypresses in 1888 and 1889. "They're constantly occupying my thoughts," he told his brother. "It astonishes me that they have not yet been done as I see them. The cypress is as beautiful of line and proportion as an Egyptian obelisk, and the green has a quality of such distinction. It's a splash of black in a sunny landscape, but it's one of the most interesting black notes and the most difficult to hit off exactly." What did Van Gogh notice about cypresses that others had not? In part, the way that they move in the wind. I walked to the end of the garden, and there studied their distinctive behavior in the mistral. Unlike the pine, whose branches descend gently downwards from the top of the tree, the fronds of the cypress thrust upwards from the ground. The trunk is unusually short, the top third of the tree being made up wholly of branches. In the wind, an oak shakes its branches, while its trunk remains immobile, but the cypress bends, and, furthermore, because of the way the fronds grow from a number of points along the circumference of the trunk, it seems to bend along different axes. From a distance, it looks as though the cypress is being shifted by several gusts of wind blowing from different angles. With its cone-like shape, the tree takes on the appearance of a flame, which in the wind seems to flicker nervously. All this Van Gogh noticed and would make others see. I had the previous day dismissed an olive tree as a squat, bush-like thing, but in his painting Olive Trees with Yellow Sky and Sun, and his painting Olive Grove, Orange Sky of 1889, Van Gogh brought out, that is, foregrounded, the shape of their trunks and leaves. I now noticed an angularity which I'd missed. The trees resembled tridents that had been flung into the soil. There was a ferocity to the olive tree's branches, too, as if they were flexed arms ready to hit out, and the taut, silvery olive leaves gave an impression of alertness and contained energy. After Van Gogh, I began to notice that there was something unusual about the colours of Provence, too. There were climatic reasons for this. The Mistral, blowing along the Rhône valley from the Alps, regularly clears the sky of clouds and moisture, leaving it a pure, rich blue, without a trace of white. At the same time, a high water table and good irrigation promotes a plant life of singular lushness for a Mediterranean climate. The vegetation draws full benefit from the great advantages of the south, light and heat, and, fortuitously, because there's no moisture in the air, there is, unlike in the tropics, no mistiness to dampen and meld the colours of the trees, flowers and plants. The combination of a cloudless sky, dry air, water and a rich vegetation leaves Provence dominated by vivid, primary, contrasting colours. Painters before Van Gogh had tended to ignore these contrasts and painted only in complementary colours, as Claude and Poussin had taught them to do. Constantin and Bidot had, for example, depicted Provence entirely in subtle gradations of soft blue and brown. Van Gogh was incensed by this neglect of Provence's natural colour scheme. He wrote, "The majority of painters, because they aren't colourists, don't see yellow, orange, sulphur in the south, and they call a painter mad if he sees with eyes other than theirs." So Van Gogh abandoned the chiaroscuro technique and soaked his canvases in primary colours, so their contrast would be at its height, red with green, yellow with purple, blue with orange. "The colour is exquisite here," he told his sister. "When the green leaves are fresh, it's a rich green, the like of which we seldom see in the north. When it gets scorched and dusty, it doesn't lose its beauty, for then the landscape gets tones of gold of various tints, green gold, yellow gold, pink gold. And this combined with the blue, from the deepest royal blue of the water to the blue of the forget-me-nots, a cobalt particularly clear, bright blue." My eyes grew attuned to see in the world the colours that had dominated Van Gogh's canvases. Everywhere I looked, I could see primary colours in contrast. Beside the house was a violet-coloured field of lavender next to a yellow field of wheat. The roofs of the buildings were orange against a pure blue sky. Green meadows were dotted with red poppies. It was not only the day that abounded in colours. Van Gogh brought out the colours of the night as well. Previous Provençal painters had depicted the night sky as little white dots on a dark background. However, when we sit under the Provençal sky on a clear night, far from the glow of houses and street lamps, we notice that the sky in fact contains a profusion of colours. Between the stars it seems a deep blue, violet or very dark green, whereas the stars themselves appear a pale yellow, orange or green, diffusing rings of light far beyond their own narrow circumference. As Van Gogh explained to his sister, the night is even more richly coloured than the day. If only you pay attention to it, you'll see that certain stars are citron yellow, others have a pink glow, or a green, blue, and forget-me-not brilliance. And, without elaborating on this theme, it will be clear that putting little white dots on a blue-black surface just isn't enough. Van Gogh also wrote to his sister that many people already said of his work, "This really looks too strange," not to mention those who think it a total abortion and utterly repulsive. The reasons for these views weren't hard to find. The walls of Van Gogh's houses weren't always straight. The sun wasn't always yellow or the grass green. There was an exaggerated movement in some of his trees. "I've played hell somewhat with the truthfulness of the colours," he admitted, and he played similar hell with proportion, line, shadow and tone. Yet in playing hell, Van Gogh was only making more explicit a process in which all artists are involved, namely choosing what aspects of reality to include and what to leave out. As Nietzsche knew, reality itself is infinite and can never be wholly represented in art. What made Van Gogh unusual among Provençal artists was his choice of what he felt was important. A painter like Constantin had expended much effort in getting the scale right. Van Gogh, though passionately interested in producing a likeness, insisted that it wasn't by worrying about scale that he would end up conveying what was important in the South. His art would involve, as he mockingly told his brother, a likeness different from the products of the God-fearing photographer. The part of reality that concerned Van Gogh sometimes required distortion, omission and substitution of colours in order to be brought to the fore. But it was still the real, the likeness, that interested him. He was willing to sacrifice a naive realism to achieve a deeper realism, behaving like a poet who, though less factual than a journalist in describing an event, may nevertheless reveal truths about it that find no place in the journalist's literal grid. Van Gogh elaborated on the idea in a letter to his brother in September 1888 concerning a portrait he was planning. "Instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use colour more arbitrarily in order to express myself forcibly. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. I should like to paint the portrait of an artist friend, a man who dreams great dreams, who works as the nightingale sings, because it's his nature. He'll be a blonde man. I want to put my appreciation, the love I have for him, into the picture. So I paint him as he is, as faithfully as I can, to begin with. But the picture is not yet finished. To finish it, I'm going to be the arbitrary colorist. I exaggerate the fairness of the hair. I even get to orange tones, chromes and pale citron yellow. Behind the head, instead of painting the ordinary wall of the mean room, I paint infinity, a plain background of the richest, intensest blue that I can contrive. And by this simple combination of the bright head against the rich blue background, I get a mysterious effect, like a star in the depths of an azure sky. Oh, my dear boy, and the nice people will only see the exaggeration as a caricature." A few weeks later, Van Gogh began another caricature. "Tonight I'm probably going to start on the interior of the cafe, where I eat by gaslight in the evening," he told his brother. "It's what they call a café de nuit. They're fairly common here, staying open all night. Night prowlers can take refuge there when they have no money to pay for a lodging, or are too drunk to be taken in." In painting what would become the night cafe in Arles, Van Gogh abandoned adherence to some elements of reality for the sake of others. He didn't reproduce the proper perspective or colour scheme of the cafe. His light bulbs metamorphosed into glowing mushrooms. The chairs arched their backs, the floor buckled. Yet Van Gogh was still interested in expressing truthful ideas about the place. ideas that would perhaps have been less well expressed if he'd had to follow the classical rules of art. My newfound enthusiasm, both for Van Gogh and for the landscapes he'd painted, was troubled by the memory of an exceptionally acerbic maxim that Pascal had penned several centuries before Van Gogh's southern journey. In his Pensées 40 he wrote, "How vain painting is, exciting admiration by its resemblance to things of which we don't admire the originals." It seemed awkwardly true that I hadn't admired Provence much before I'd come across its depiction in Van Gogh's work. But, in its desire to mock art lovers, Pascal's maxim was in danger of skirting over two important points. To start to admire a painting that depicts a place we know but don't like sounds absurd and pretentious if we imagine that all painters do is to reproduce exactly what lies before them. If they did, then the only thing we would be admiring in a painting would be the technical skills involved in reproducing an object, in which case there would be little difficulty in agreeing with Pascal's description of painting as a vain pursuit. But, as Nietzsche knew, painters don't merely reproduce, they select and highlight, and they're accorded genuine admiration insofar as their version of reality seems to bring out valuable features of it. Furthermore, we don't have to resume our indifference to a place once the painting of it that we admired is out of sight, as Pascal hints we might. The capacity to appreciate can transfer from art to the world. We can find things that delight us on a canvas first, but then later welcome them in the place where the canvas was painted. We can continue to see cypresses beyond Van Gogh's paintings. On possessing beauty. Among all the places we go to, a few stand out with an impact that overwhelms us and forces us to take heed. They possess a quality that might clumsily be called beauty. This may not involve prettiness or any of the obvious features that guidebooks associate with beauty spots. There was much beauty on my travels. In Amsterdam, in a courtyard behind a wooden door, there was an old brick wall, which, despite a tear-inducing wind blowing along the canals, had slowly heated itself up in a fragile early spring sun. I ran my hands along the brick's gnarled and pitted surface. They seemed light and ready to crumble. I had an impulse to kiss them, to feel more closely a texture that reminded me of halva from a Lebanese delicatessen. In Barbados, I looked out across a dark violet sea that continued unhindered to the coasts of Africa. In the Lake District, I remembered the view at dawn from our window in the Mortal Man Inn. Hills of soft Silurian rock covered in fine green grass, above which a layer of mist was hovering. The hills undulated as though they formed part of the backbone of a giant beast that had lain down to sleep and might at any point awake and stand up several miles high, shaking off oak trees and hedgerows like pieces of fluff caught on its felt green jacket. A dominant impulse on encountering beauty is the desire to hold on to it, to possess it. There is an urge to say, "I was here, I saw this, and it mattered to me." But beauty is fugitive. It's frequently found in places to which we may never return, or else it results from a rare conjunction of season, light, and weather. How then to possess it? How to hold on to the halva-like bricks or the English valley? The camera provides one option. Taking photographs can assuage the itch for possession sparked by beauty. Our anxiety about losing a precious scene can decline with every click of the shutter. Or else we can try to imprint ourselves physically on a place of beauty, perhaps hoping to render it more present in us by making ourselves more present in it. In Alexandria, standing before Pompey's pillar, we could try to carve our name in the granite, to follow the example of Flaubert's friend Thompson from Sunderland. A more modest step might be to buy something, a bowl, a lacquered box, or a pair of sandals. Even Flaubert acquired 3 carpets in Cairo, to be reminded of what we've lost. John Ruskin was born in London in February 1819. A central part of his work was to pivot around the question of how we can possess the beauty of places. Ruskin judged the twin purposes of art were to make sense of pain and to fathom the sources of beauty. From an early age, he was unusually alive to the smallest features of the visual world. He recalled that, at 3 or 4, I could pass my days contentedly in tracing the squares and comparing the colours of my carpet, examining the knots in the wood of the floor, or counting the bricks in the opposite houses with rapturous intervals of excitement. Ruskin's parents encouraged his sensitivity. His mother introduced him to nature. His father, a prosperous sherry importer, read the classics to him after tea and took him to a museum every Saturday. In the summer holidays, the family travelled around the British Isles and mainland Europe for beauty, by which they understood chiefly the beauty of the Alps and of the medieval cities of northern France and Italy. From his interest in beauty and in its possession, Ruskin arrived at 5 central conclusions. Firstly, that beauty is the result of a complex number of factors that affect the mind psychologically and visually. Secondly, that humans have an innate tendency to respond to beauty and to desire to possess it. Thirdly, that there are many lower expressions of this desire for possession, including the desire to buy souvenirs and carpets, to carve one's name in pillars, and to take photographs. Fourthly, that there is only one way to possess beauty properly, and that is through understanding it, through making ourselves conscious of the factors, psychological and visual, that are responsible for it. And lastly, that the most effective way of pursuing this conscious understanding is by attempting to describe beautiful places through art, through writing or drawing them, irrespective of whether we happen to have any talent for doing so. Between 1856 and 1860, Ruskin's primary intellectual concern was to teach people how to draw. The art of drawing, he wrote, which is of more real importance to the human race than that of writing, and should be taught to every child, just as writing is, has been so neglected and abused that there is not one man in 1,000, even of its professed teachers, who know its first principles. To begin rectifying the damage, Ruskin published 2 books, The Elements of Drawing in 1857 and The Elements of Perspective in 1859, and he gave a series of lectures at the Working Men's College in London, where he instructed students, mostly Cockney craftsmen, in shading, colour, dimension, perspective and framing. The lectures were heavily subscribed, and the books were critical and commercial successes, confirming Ruskin in his view that drawing should not be for the few. He wrote, "There is a satisfactory and available power in everyone to learn drawing if he wishes, just as nearly all persons have the power of learning French, Latin, or arithmetic in a decent and useful degree." But what was the point of drawing? Ruskin saw no paradox in stressing that it had nothing to do with drawing well or with becoming an artist. A man is born an artist, he declared, as a hippopotamus is born a hippopotamus, and you can no more make yourself one than you can make yourself a giraffe. Ruskin didn't mind if his East End students left his classes unable to draw anything that could ever hang in a gallery. My efforts are directed not to making a carpenter an artist, but to making him happier as a carpenter, he told a Royal Commission into Drawing in 1857. If drawing had value, even when it was practiced by people with no talent, it was for Ruskin, because drawing could teach us to see, to notice rather than to look. In the process of recreating with our own hand what lies before our eyes, we seem naturally to move from a position of observing beauty in a loose way to one where we acquire a deep understanding of its constituent parts, and hence more secure memories of it. A tradesman who had studied at the Working Men's College reported what Ruskin had told him and his fellow students at the end of their course. "Now remember, gentlemen, that I've not been trying to teach you to draw, only to see. Two men are walking through Clare Market. One of them comes out at the other end not a bit wiser than when he went in. The other notices a bit of parsley hanging over the edge of a butter woman's basket, and carries away with him images of beauty which in the course of his daily work he incorporates with it for many days. I want you to see things like these." Ruskin was distressed by just how seldom people notice details. He deplored the blindness and haste of modern tourists, especially those who prided themselves on covering Europe in a week by train. Ruskin wrote, "No changing of place at 100 miles an hour will make us one whit stronger, happier, or wiser. There was always more in the world than men could see, walked they ever so slowly. They will see it no better for going fast. The really precious things are thought and sight, not pace. It does a bullet no good to go fast, and a man, if he be truly a man, no harm to go slow. For his glory is not at all in going, but in being." It's a measure of how accustomed we are to inattention that we would be thought unusual and perhaps dangerous if we stopped and stared at a place for as long as a sketcher would require to draw it. 10 minutes of acute concentration at least are needed to draw a tree. The prettiest tree rarely stops passers-by for longer than a minute. What then is so wrong with the camera? Nothing, thought Ruskin initially. Among all the mechanical poison that this terrible 19th century has poured upon men, it has given us at any rate one antidote, he wrote of Louis-Jacques Mondet's invention of 1839. In Venice in 1845, he used a daguerreotype repeatedly and delighted in the results. To his father he wrote, "Daguerreotypes taken by this vivid sunlight are glorious things. It's very nearly the same thing as carrying off a palace itself. Every chip of stone and stain is there, and of course there can be no mistakes about proportion." Yet Ruskin's enthusiasm diminished as he observed the devilish problem that photography created for the majority of its practitioners. Rather than using photography as a supplement to active, conscious seeing, they used it as an alternative, paying less attention to the world than they had done previously, from a faith that photography automatically assured them possession of it. In explaining his love of drawing, it was rare for him to travel anywhere without sketching something. Ruskin once remarked that it arose from a desire, not for reputation, nor for the good of others, nor for my own advantage, but from a sort of instinct, like that of eating or drinking. What unites the three activities is that they all involve assimilations by the self of desirable elements from the world, a transfer of goodness from without to within. As a child, Ruskin had so loved the look of grass that he'd frequently wanted to eat it, he said, but he'd gradually discovered that it would be better to try to draw it. I used to lie down on it, he wrote, and draw the blades as they grew, until every square foot of meadow or mossy bank became a possession to me. But photography alone cannot ensure such eating. True possession of a scene is a matter of making a conscious effort to notice elements and understand their construction. We can see beauty well enough just by opening our eyes, but how long this beauty survives in memory depends on how intentionally we've apprehended it. The camera blurs the distinction between looking and noticing, between seeing and possessing. It may give us the option of true knowledge, but it may unwittingly make the effort of acquiring it seem superfluous. It suggests we've done all the work simply by taking a photograph, whereas properly to eat a place, a woodland for example, implies asking ourselves a series of questions like, how do the stems connect to the roots? Where is the mist coming from? Why does one tree seem darker than another? Questions implicitly raised and answered in the process of sketching. Encouraged by Ruskin's democratic vision of drawing, I tried my hand during my travels. As for what to draw, it seemed sensible to be guided by the desire to possess beauty, which had previously led me to take up my camera. In Ruskin's words, "Your art is to be the praise of something that you love. It may only be the praise of a shell or a stone." I decided to draw the bedroom window at the Mortal Man Inn, because it was to hand and seemed attractive on a bright autumn morning. The result was a predictable yet instructive disaster. Drawing an object, however badly, swiftly takes us from a woolly sense of what it looks like to a precise awareness of its component parts and particularities. So, a window reveals itself to be made of a succession of ledges holding the glass in place, of a system of ridges and indentations, of 12 panes that might seem square, but are in fact mildly but importantly rectangular, of white paint that doesn't really look white, but ash grey, brown grey, yellow, pinky mauve, and mild green, depending on the light and on the relationship between this light and the condition of the wood. In the northwestern edge of the window, a trace of damp gave the paint a pinky tint. Nor is glass wholly clear. It has within it minute imperfections, tiny bubbles of air like a frozen fizzy drink, and on its surface mine had been marked with the traces of dried raindrops and the impatient swipes of a window cleaner's cloth. Drawing brutally shows up our previous blindness to the true appearance of things. Another benefit we may receive from drawing is a conscious understanding of the reasons behind our attractions to certain landscapes and buildings. We find explanations for our tastes. We develop an aesthetic, a capacity to assert judgments about beauty and ugliness. We determine with greater precision what is missing in a building we don't like and what contributes to the beauty of the one we do. We more quickly analyze a scene that impresses us and pin down whence its power arises. The combination of limestone and evening sun, or the way the trees taper down to the river. We move from a numb, "I like this," to "I like this because," and then in turn towards a generalization about the likable. And on the basis of this conscious awareness, more solid memories can be founded. Carving our name on Pompey's pillar begins to seem a little unnecessary. Drawing allows us, in Ruskin's account, to stay the cloud in its fading, the leaf in its trembling, and the shadows in their changing. Ruskin didn't only encourage us to draw on our travels. He also felt that we should write, or as he called it, word paint, so as to cement our impressions of beauty. However respected he was in his lifetime for his drawings, it was actually his word paintings that captured the public imagination and were responsible for his fame in the late Victorian period. Attractive places typically render us aware of our inadequacies with language. In the Lake District, while writing a postcard to a friend, I explained in some despair and haste that the scenery was pretty and the weather wet and windy. Ruskin would have ascribed such prose more to laziness than incapacity. We were all, he argued, able to turn out adequate word paintings. A failure was only the result of not asking ourselves enough questions, of not being more precise in analyzing what we had seen and felt. Rather than rest with the idea that a lake was pretty, we were to ask ourselves more vigorously, what in particular is attractive about this stretch of water? What are its associations? What is a better word for it than big? The finished product might not then be marked by genius, but at least it would have been motivated by a search for an authentic representation of an experience. Ruskin was, throughout his adult life, frustrated by the refusal of polite, educated English people to talk in sufficient depth about the weather, and in particular by their tendency to refer to the weather as wet and windy. He wrote, "It's a strange thing how little people know about the sky. We never attend to it. We never make it a subject of thought. We look upon it only as a succession of meaningless and monotonous accidents, too common and too vain to be worthy of a moment of watchfulness or a glance of admiration. If in our moments of utter idleness and insipidity we turn to the sky as a last resource, which of its phenomena do we speak of? One says it's been wet, and another it's been windy, and another it's been warm. Who among the whole chattering crowd can tell me of the forms and the precipices of the chain of tall white mountains that girded the horizon at noon today? Who saw the narrow sunbeam that came out of the south and smote upon their summits until they melted and mouldered away in a dust of blue rain? Who saw the dance of the dead clouds when the sunlight left them last night and the west wind blew them before it like withered leaves? The answer was, of course, Ruskin himself, who liked to boast, in another analogy between the function of art and that of eating and drinking, that he bottled skies as carefully as his sherry-importing father bottled cherries. Here is a diary entry of a sky-bottling day in London in the autumn of 1857. November 1st, a vermilion morning, all waves of soft scarlet, sharp at the edge and gradated to purple. Grey scud moving slowly beneath it from the southwest. Heaps of grey cumuli between the scud and cirrus at horizon. It issued in an exquisite day, all purple and blue in distance, and misty sunshine near on the trees and green fields. Note the exquisite effect of the golden leaves scattered on the blue sky, and the horse chestnut, thin and small, dark against them in stars. The effectiveness of Ruskin's word painting derived from his method of not only describing what places looked like, the grass green, the earth grey-brown, but also of analysing their power in psychological language, the grass expansive, the earth timid. He recognised that many places strike us as beautiful, not on the basis of aesthetic criteria, because the colours match or there is symmetry in proportion, but on the basis of psychological criteria, because they embody a value or mood of importance to us. In the Alps, he described pine trees and rocks in psychological terms. He wrote, "I can never stay long without awe under an alpine cliff, looking up to its pines as they stand on the inaccessible juts and perilous ledges of an enormous wall, in quiet multitudes, each like the shadow of the one beside it, upright, fixed, not knowing each other. You cannot reach them, cannot cry to them. Those trees never heard human voice. They're far above all sound but of the winds. No foot ever stirred fallen leaf of theirs. All comfortless they stand, yet with such an iron will that the rock itself looks bent and shattered beside them, fragile, weak, inconsistent compared to their dark energy of delicate life and monotony of enchanted pride." Through such psychological descriptions, we seem to come closer to answering the question of why a place has stirred us. We come closer to the Ruskinian goal of consciously understanding what we have loved. On habit. I returned to London from Barbados to find that the city had stubbornly refused to change. I had seen azure skies and giant sea anemones. I had slept in a raffia bungalow and eaten a kingfish. I'd swum beside baby turtles and read in the shade of coconut trees. But the home town was unimpressed. It was still raining, the park was still a pond, and the skies funereal. When we're in a good mood and it's sunny, it's tempting to impute a connection between what happens inside and outside of us. But the appearance of London on my return was a reminder of the indifference of the world to any of the events unfolding in the lives of its inhabitants. I felt despair to be home. I felt there could be few worse places on earth than the one I'd been fated to spend my existence in. The sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he doesn't know how to stay quietly in his room. Pascal, Pensée 136. From 1799 to 1804, Alexander von Humboldt undertook a journey around South America, later entitling the account of what he'd seen, Journey to the Equinoctial Regions of the New Continent. 9 years earlier, in the spring of 1790, a 27-year-old Frenchman, Xavier de Maistre, undertook a journey around his bedroom, later entitling the account of what he'd seen, Journey Around My Bedroom. Gratified by his experiences, in 1798, de Maistre undertook a second journey. This time he travelled by night and ventured out as far as the window ledge, later entitling his account, Nocturnal Expedition Around My Bedroom. 2 approaches to travel: Journey to the Equinoctial Regions of the New Continent, or Journey Around My Bedroom. The first required 10 mules, 30 pieces of luggage, 4 interpreters, a chronometer, 2 telescopes, a border theodolite, a barometer, a compass, a hygrometer, letters of introduction from the King of Spain, and a gun. The second, a pair of pink and blue cotton pyjamas. Xavier de Maistre was born in 1763 in the picturesque town of Chambéry at the foot of the French Alps. He was of an intense romantic nature, was fond of reading, especially Montaigne, Pascal, and Rousseau, and of paintings, especially Dutch and French domestic scenes. At the age of 23, de Maistre became fascinated by aeronautics. Etienne Montgolfier had, 3 years before, achieved international renown by constructing a balloon that flew for 8 minutes above the royal palace at Versailles, bearing as passengers a sheep called Montociel, climbed to the sky, a duck and a rooster. De Maistre and a friend constructed a pair of giant wings out of paper and wire and planned to fly to America. They didn't succeed. 2 years later, de Maistre secured himself a place in a hot air balloon and spent a few moments floating above Chambéry before the machine crashed into a pine forest. Then in 1790, while he was living in a modest room at the top of an apartment building in Turin, de Maistre pioneered a mode of travel that was to make his name: room travel. Introducing Journey Around My Bedroom, Xavier's brother, the political theorist Joseph de Maistre, emphasized that it was not Xavier's intention to cast aspersions on the heroic deeds of the great travellers of the past: Magellan, Drake, Anson, and Cook. Magellan had discovered a western route to the Spice Islands around the southern tip of South America. Drake had circumnavigated the globe. Anson had produced accurate sea charts of the Philippines, and Cook had confirmed the existence of a southern continent. They were no doubt remarkable men, wrote Joseph. It was just that his brother had discovered a way of travelling that might be infinitely more practical for those neither as brave nor as wealthy as they. As he prepared for his journey, Xavier de Maistre explained, "Millions of people who, before me, had never dared to travel, others who'd not been able to travel, and still more who'd not even thought of travelling, will now be able to follow my example. The most indolent beings won't have any more reason to hesitate before setting off to find pleasures that will cost them neither money nor effort." Xavier particularly recommended room travel to the poor and to those afraid of storms, robberies, and high cliffs. Unfortunately, de Maistre's own pioneering journey, rather like his flying machine, didn't fly very far. The story begins well. De Maistre locks his door and changes into his pink and blue pyjamas. Without the need for luggage, he travels to the sofa, the largest piece of furniture in the room. His journey having shaken him from his usual lethargy, he looks at it through fresh eyes, and rediscovers some of its qualities. He admires the elegance of its feet, and remembers the pleasant hours he spent cradled in its cushions, dreaming of love and advancement in his career. From his sofa, de Maistre spies his bed. Once again, from a traveller's vantage point, he learns to appreciate this complex piece of furniture. He feels grateful for the nights he spent in it, and takes pride that his sheets almost match his pyjamas. "I advise every man who can to get himself pink and white bed linen," he writes, "for these are colours to induce calm and pleasant reveries in the fragile sleeper." But thereafter de Maistre may be accused of losing sight of the overall purpose of his endeavour. He becomes mired in long and wearying digressions about his dog Rosine, his sweetheart Jenny, and his faithful servant Joanetti. Travellers in search of a specific report on room travel risk closing Journey Around My Bedroom feeling just a little betrayed. And yet, de Maistre's work springs from a profound and suggestive insight, that the pleasure we derive from journeys is perhaps dependent more on the mindset with which we travel than on the destination we travel to. If only we could apply a travelling mindset to our own homes, we might find these places becoming no less interesting than the high mountain passes and butterfly-filled jungles of Humboldt, South America. What then is a travelling mindset? Receptivity might be said to be its chief characteristic. We approach new places with humility. We carry with us no rigid ideas about what is interesting. We irritate locals because we stand in traffic islands and narrow streets and admire what they take to be strange small details. We risk getting run over because we're intrigued by the roof of a government building or an inscription on a wall. We find a supermarket or hairdressers unusually fascinating. We dwell at length on the layout of a menu or the clothes of the presenters on the evening news. We're alive to the layers of history beneath the present and take notes and photographs. Home, on the other hand, finds us more settled in our expectations. We feel assured that we've discovered everything interesting about a neighbourhood, primarily by virtue of having lived there a long time. It seems inconceivable that there could be anything new to find in a place which we've been living in for a decade or more. We've become habituated and therefore blind. De Maistre tried to shake us from our passivity. In his second volume of Room Travel, entitled Nocturnal Expedition Around My Bedroom, he went to his window and looked up at the night sky. Its beauty made him frustrated that such ordinary scenes were not more generally appreciated. He wrote, "How few people are, right now, taking delight in this sublime spectacle, which the sky lays on uselessly for dozing humanity. What would it cost those who are out for a walk or crowding out of the theatre to look up for a moment and admire the brilliant constellations which gleam above their heads? The reason they weren't looking was that they'd never done so before. They'd fallen into the habit of considering their universe to be boring, and it had duly fallen into line with their expectations." De Maistre was not only a room traveller. He was also a great traveller in the classic sense. He journeyed to Italy and Russia. He spent a winter with the royalist armies in the Alps, and fought a Russian campaign in the Caucasus. In an autobiographical note written in 1801 in South America, Alexander von Humboldt had written of his motives for travelling. "I was spurred on by an uncertain longing to be transported from a boring daily life to a marvellous world." It was this dichotomy, boring daily life, pitted against marvellous world, that de Maistre had tried to redraw with greater subtlety. He wouldn't have told Humboldt that South America was dull. He would merely have urged him to consider that his native Berlin might have something to offer too. 8 decades later, Nietzsche, who had read and admired de Maistre and spent much time in his room, picked up on the thought. He wrote, "When we observe how some people know how to manage their experiences, their insignificant, everyday experiences, so that they become an arable soil that bears fruit 3 times a year, while others, and how many there are driven through surging waves of destiny, the most multifarious currents of the times and the nations, and yet always remain on top, bobbing like a cork, then we're in the end tempted to divide mankind into a minority, a minimality, of those who know how to make much of little, and a majority of those who know how to make little of much." We meet people who have crossed deserts, floated on ice caps, and cut their way through jungles, and yet in whose souls we would search in vain for evidence of what they've witnessed. Dressed in pink and blue pyjamas, satisfied by the confines of his own bedroom, Xavier de Maistre was gently nudging us to try, before taking off for distant hemispheres, to notice what we've already seen. The Art of Travel was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.